Chapter 7. Aran. The tiny, battered escape pod had barely made it out of atmosphere before the raider ship was after them. Istvay swore through their teeth, glancing over their shoulder at Aran. "I sent the star map through to your wavelink earlier," they gritted. "Give me something. We have to get somewhere out of the way as quick as we can. There are no weapons on this thing. We're not going to last 5 minutes." Aran yanked out his palm screen and peered at it as it flickered unevenly. Damn it. This was not the time for technology malfunctions. He glanced up at the ship screen, orienting himself, then back down at his palm screen. It doesn't need to be a perfect place. Just get us somewhere we can land. It's possible that once we get in atmosphere, we'll be able to, get them off our tail somehow. Istvay snapped. Their voice was tight with strain. Aran hesitated. "You're not going to like this," he murmured. A shot hummed out from the raider ship behind them, and Istvay yanked down on the controls. "Damn it, Aran! I don't actually—" Aran crouched beside his friend and tapped a planet on the screen. "There. That's the only option, if you want something that's close and gives us a chance of breathing oxygen instead of sulfur gas." Istvay glanced at the map. Then they looked back up at Aran, their expression incredulous. "That's—" Aran nodded. "I told you wouldn't like it." Istvay continued staring. "We're running for our lives from the raiders, and you want me to put down on the raiders' actual base planet. That's what you're suggesting." Aran rolled his eyes. "Look, you said you wanted a place that was close and wouldn't kill us, so that's our option." Istvay glanced at the screen, then back at Aran, then back at the screen, their expression irresolute. There was another shot from the ship behind them, another blue streak of energy, and Istvay yanked desperately on the controls. "Damn it! This thing was not built for maneuverability," they grunted, "and I sure as hell never studied as a damn pilot." Another shot whispered out, and this time it must have hit, because the screen flickered crazily, the ship shaking hard enough to throw Aran against the curved wall of the cockpit, cushioned slightly by Ani's bulbous body. She grumbled a complaint and nicked the back of his hand with a tentacle spike in protest. "Sorry, sweetheart," he gasped, wincing at the now familiar jolt of pain shooting up his arm. Istvay was cursing steadily. "Well, looks like the choice has been made for us. That shot cracked the shell of the pod. We have maybe 40 minutes before the emergency seal gives out and she breaks up completely." Aran stared up ahead of them at the small moon that, they'd learned only this morning, might hold the answers he'd been searching for, desperately, for years. The place that could very well become both his and Istvay's grave. "Well," he said, trying to keep the sheer terror from his voice, "at least we know it'll have oxygen." "We assume it'll have oxygen," Istvay grumbled. "Those damn raiders could be adapted to breathe sulfur gas, for all we know." "I don't think so," said Aran thoughtfully. "From what I saw of their physiology—" "This is not the damn time for a scientific discussion," Istvay snapped. They were wrestling with the controls, trying to turn the pod towards the moon. "Because if their next damn shot breaches our fuel cell, we're going to go up exactly like the diplomatic ship did. Even if we don't get hit again, there's still a solid chance we'll go up in flames the moment we enter the atmosphere. If we can even make it through to the atmosphere, because, like I said, I'm not a damn trick pilot, and I'm piloting a bloody escape pod, and we just got shot." Aran glanced at his friend and bit back a retort. They were probably right, honestly. "Can I do anything?" he asked instead. Istvay looked up briefly to glare at him. "I don't know. Maybe you can go out there and explain to your friends the raiders that we need a little tow. Maybe that would help." Aran sighed. There was no point in even trying to talk to Istvay when they were in this mood. He knew, deep down, that he was probably right on the edge of actually losing his crap, and that his irritation, just as much as Istvay's, was simply his brain's mechanism to avoid going into a full-scale meltdown. "Go strap in," said Istvay tersely. "If we make it through the atmosphere, and I'm going to tell you right now, that's a hell of an if, it's going to be a rough landing." Aran closed his eyes and swallowed hard. Yeah, I'll do that." Istvay glanced up at him, and underneath the frantic tension, There was that familiar concern on their face, and somehow the sight of it made Aran smile, however weakly. "Well, there's no one I'd rather be in a crashing spaceship with than you," he managed. Istvay blinked at him, then gave a strained grin of their own. "That's good, because it doesn't look like you're going to have much of a choice. Now go strap in." Aran ducked back into the main body of the escape pod and strapped himself in to one of the tiny pod seats. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes and tried, very hard, not to think about what was happening right now, not to remember where he was and what he was bloody well doing here. Tried not to think about the fact that dying in space had quite literally been his nightmare, one that he'd woken from screaming, for as long as he had understood there was such a thing as space. Ani seemed to have forgiven him for squashing her against the escape pod walls, because she was huddled up on his shoulder, making quiet little chirps and stroking his arm delicately with the tip of a tentacle. He reached up, rubbing under her chin. "It's okay, Ani," he whispered. "It's okay. Istvay's got this. We'll be fine." She purred and tried to nudge herself under his hand, and he managed a small smile as he rubbed her head. Her purring increased, her eyes closing to slits. At least she could be stoic in the face of almost certain death. "We're on our way in," said Istvay shortly. "Hold on to something if you can. If the pod shell is going to fail, it'll be in the next few seconds." And then the ship hit the atmosphere, the impact sending the small craft rocking. Aran caught one of Ani's tentacles with one hand and clung to the straps with the other, his eyes squeezed closed. His mind was going desperately over one of the hazily remembered Orthodox litanies he'd learned in childhood. "We seek not to know, but only to be known," he muttered, "not to question, but only to accept." The ship shook harder. He gulped in a quick breath, feeling Ani's tentacles tighten down on his shoulder. He didn't even have the mental energy to scold her. If she forgot and pricked him enough times to put him in a coma, maybe that would be the best outcome, all things considered. "For what we know is foolishness, and what we perceive is illusion, and only your everlasting presence is the true... Damn it. He couldn't remember the rest. The craft was shaking harder now, and when he cracked one eye open, he could see Istvay in the cockpit, their shoulders tight, their knuckles white on the controls. He squeezed his eyes shut again. Damn it to hell. The craft was shaking hard enough now that he was sure he'd have bruises from being slammed against the pod walls, assuming he lived long enough to develop bruises. "We're through the atmosphere!" Istvay shouted back over the rush of air from outside. "But the steering on this thing is shot to hell, and I don't know if I can get the landing gear down. I've pulled all the air brakes on full, but I don't know if it's going to be enough." Their voice was sharp with strain, their words terse. Aran didn't bother to respond. He wasn't sure he could anyways. There was green outside the pod windows, coming up far too quickly, then a horrific, grinding screech, loud enough to drown out Istvay's cursing. The impact jolted through every bone in Aran's body, his jaw snapping shut, his head whipping back, connecting with the shell of the pod hard enough that he saw stars, the restraints cutting into his shoulders and hips as he was flung against them. Ani clung to him, hissing her disapproval, and the screeching, tearing, ear-rending noise from outside was almost as painful as the pain itself. And then everything stilled. Aran groaned in the sudden silence, taking stock for a moment of which parts of him were still attached. They all seemed to be, and he cracked an eye open. Then he remembered and jerked his head up, the movement sending a sharp bolt of pain through his neck and back and setting his head spinning. He ignored it. "Pishti! Pishti! Are you all right? Pishti!" He could make out the outline of Istvay's shape slumped against the controls of the ship, and he was hit with a jolt of panic so strong that he thought he might pass out. He yanked ineffectually at the straps, then finally pulled out his bushblade and sliced through them, hands shaking. He tried to get to his feet, swearing at the spike of pain that shot up his hip and back at the movement. "Pishti! Pishti! Can you hear me? Pishti!" He stumbled forward to where Istvay lay, unresponsive, sprawled across the controls. There was blood smeared on the panel, and Aran's heart, already racing, sped up more, his muscles shaky with panic. He reached out gently, laying a careful hand on Istvay's shoulder, then let the tips of his fingers slide to the side of their throat, trying not to imagine what he would do if... There was a pulse. Relief washed through him so strongly he had to catch himself on the control panel, his knees going weak. Istvay groaned and stirred. Pishti! The words choked in Aran's throat. Pishti, you're all right. Istvay groaned again and pushed himself up. Blood streamed freely from their nose and split lips, and more trickled from a cut over one eyebrow, giving them a gruesome appearance. Their face was swollen and bruised, and they moved gingerly, as if trying to avoid jarring any broken bones. But they managed a brief smile through swollen lips. All right, might be pushing it, they muttered. But alive? Definitely. There's no damn way being dead could hurt this much. Aran gave a choked half-laugh, and Istvay chuckled, then groaned again. Oof, don't make me laugh, that bloody hurts. Istvay dragged himself gingerly from the seat of the craft, Aran helping where he could, and finally they were on their feet, swaying but upright. Well, we're here now anyways, they muttered sourly, glancing out the cracked window of the craft. And I guess you were right about the oxygen, since we'd both be dead if you weren't. Aran nodded, peering out the shattered cockpit window. At least, he began. Then his eyes caught movement in the sky above them, and he swore violently. Aran! Istvay's voice was sharp with concern. Aran, what? They're still after us, Aran snapped. Come on, we've got to get out of here. He was already stumbling back to the pod's storage compartments. He yanked them open, pulling out supplies and throwing them into a knapsack. We don't have time, Istvay began, but Aran cut them off. We don't have time not to. I have no idea if the water here is even drinkable, and we won't make it far without food or something to keep warm. He shoved a first aid kit into the pack on top of the jumble of supplies, snapped it shut, and slung it over his shoulders. Ani scrambled up his outstretched arm and took her perch atop the knapsack. Istvay had their own supplies pouch open and was rummaging through it, their face tight with pain. They straightened, shoving something at Aran. Here, scent blockers. You saw the raiders back there. They were bloody well sniffing us out. Aran grabbed the small pouches from Istvay's hand, glancing out the window again as he smeared the oily goop over his skin and clothing. He tucked the pouch in his pocket, activating it as he did so. They've landed, he said tersely, turning back to Istvay. They'll be here in minutes. Istvay gave a brusque nod and turned for the hatch, then swayed on their feet. Aran caught them, pulling them upright, and Istvay hissed in pain. Aran looked them over in concern, but they shook their head. Let's go, they whispered. The pod's hull had been smashed, the hatch door jammed shut, but with some effort, Aran managed to expand the broken hole in the plex window of the cockpit, enough to allow the two of them to wriggle through. Istvay followed him out, swearing in a muffled litany under their breath. Then they were both on their feet again, standing amidst the cool of an evergreen forest. The air was thick and humid, richer than the air on the previous planet, but not enough to make breathing uncomfortable. From somewhere on the other side of the broken pod, there was the crunch of heavy footsteps approaching at a quick jog. Aran glanced around quickly, then tipped his chin in the direction of the forest, and he and Istvay ducked into the dark shadows of the trees. Aran crept along carefully, keeping his steps light so as not to break twigs or crunch leaves. This, at least, was something both he and Istvay were intimately familiar with, and soon they fell into a steady, comfortable rhythm, Aran checking the ground before him as he placed his feet, Istvay stepping where Aran stepped and using a wide branch to brush away any sign of their passage. Ani, perched on Aran's shoulder, was silent and alert, apparently recognizing the familiarity of the routine as much as either of them. They hadn't been walking for more than a few minutes when there was a muffled boom from behind them, followed by a shockwave that was almost enough to knock Aran off his feet. He caught himself against a tree, and Istvay, cursing under their breath, didn't. Pishti? Aran hissed in alarm, but Istvay pushed themselves painfully to their feet, grimacing. Stupid crash did something to my balance, they muttered. They blinked, shaking their head. What the hell was that? Aran glanced around. I'll be right back, he said. Before Istve could protest, he spat on his hands and pulled himself up the branches of one of the larger of the nearby trees, just far enough up to see over the ridge of the hill they'd come over. In the clearing where they'd left the pod, there was nothing but a massive, crackling ball of flames. He stared at it for a long moment, then, silently, he slid back down the tree. What? Hissed Istve impatiently. What did they... That was our escape pod, Aran said in a low voice. It's gone. Istve stared at him for a moment, then dropped their head into their hands, shoulders slumping in exhaustion. Finally, they raised their head and gave Aran a weary smile. I guess we're staying here then until we find another ride, they said. We'd better damn well hope not all the raiders are as friendly as these ones. From somewhere behind them came the unmistakable crunch of a footstep. Istve swore again. Come on, we've got to keep going. Aran nodded, and the two of them turned, heading farther into the trackless forest. Chapter 8. Savina. Getting passage to the Yibo city, Chur it was called, apparently, had been easier than Savina had expected. She'd found an older Yibo setting up for the early morning market, who spoke a few words of common dialect, and had managed, between their few words of shared language and some pantomiming, to convey what she needed. He'd led her to a woman loading a small transport ship, and in exchange for Savina's offer of assistance, the woman had agreed to bring her along. Savina had been at her sweetest and most helpful. How could they possibly refuse? The trip back to the jungle planet Savina had so recently left took several standard hours, but even the small Yibo transport craft had artificial gravity, and Savina was able to lean her seat back and fall into a restless sleep and ignore the frantic wavelength messages from her damn baby brother back in the village. She woke once to find the Yibo woman asleep as well, leaned back in her chair, the controls set to autopilot. Her breath was coming slow and easy, and she was clearly deeply asleep, and it would be so incredibly easy for Savina to pull out her knife. She sighed in frustration and leaned back again, closing her eyes. When had her life gotten this complicated? It had never been this complicated before. They reached the jungle planet and came down through the atmosphere as the sun was peeking over the horizon behind the city, setting it glowing in the early morning air. The Yibo woman called in on the ship radio, and when she received an answer, she brought her ship in, low along the cleared outskirts of the city, terrain that Savina recognized by having run for her life through it short days previous. There were Yibo guards waiting to greet them, and they started towards the ship as it came at last to a halt. Savina's hand went surreptitiously to her knife. The Yibo women glanced at the guards, then over at Savina, her expression indecisive. Then she tapped the radio on her dashboard. Savina tensed. She could make it look like a heart attack. They'd find the dead woman, and they'd never know there'd been a human here at all. She watched the woman casually, working her needle-thin electric knife free of its sheath. She could understand Yibo now, thanks to the translation chip her stupid baby brother had handed her, and the woman had no way of knowing. That should give Savina some advantage, at least. "Give me just a minute," said the woman over the radio. "I had some cargo shift on the way through the atmosphere, and it's blocking the exit. Let me clear it out so you can get in without tripping over it." She shut off the transmission, then turned to Savina. "Go on," she whispered, making a shooing gesture. "Best get out of here while you can." Savina stared. Then she caught herself and shoved the knife hastily back into its sheath. The woman shooed her again. "Go on, human," she said, as if talking to her dog. "It'll be safer for you if you get in without being seen." She sighed. "I'm talking to it like it can understand me," she mumbled under her breath. Savina blinked at her, then recovered herself and gave the woman an innocent smile. "Thank you," she said breathlessly. "I know you can't understand me, but thank you." She wasn't, in fact, sure the woman couldn't understand her. It was always best not to take people, or Yibo, at their word. But as long as the woman had decided not to turn her in, it hardly mattered. She ducked out the back hatch and into the open fields, and the Yibo woman closed the hatch behind her. The rising sun warmed Savina's shoulders as she made her way across the uneven ground towards the city, birds chirping lazily from the jungle behind her, and she took a deep breath, rolling the stiffness from her shoulders. Despite everything, she found there was a slight spring to her step, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. It had been far, far too long since her life had been simple, since she'd kidnapped Joska and Rafael, been hunted by Reka, found her long-lost baby brother. The thought of Reka made something twist in her chest, something complicated and suffocating, and she shoved it back. It was a good thing Reka was dead. It didn't matter that there was something about her that had pulled at Savina's gut with an aching longing she couldn't explain, something about the way she looked at Savina, how her cold gaze had cut through all the affected innocence and simplicity Savina had spent her whole life perfecting, as if it wasn't there. Savina didn't need to be seen for who she was. It was dangerous and stupid, and it could get her killed, but in the end her act had worked after all. Reka had underestimated her, and now Reka was dead, and Savina had killed her. And here, just for now, everything was simple again. She had a goal and a plan to get there. No one to worry about, no one to explain to, no complicated moral decisions, just her and her knives, and a whole city of people to be manipulated at her will. She closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath of humid jungle air. This she could do. This she was good at. For the first time in a very long time, she was playing a game she knew, with rules that made sense. She hadn't realized how satisfying a feeling that could be. She stayed off the main road, and when she reached the city entrance, she ducked out of sight behind some of the quick-growing vegetation that surrounded the city and seemed to spring up here almost overnight. She still wore Yibo clothing, and although she looked nothing like the creatures, the height difference wasn't as dramatic as it would have been with Joska or Benny. When a large group of chattering, laughing Yibo workers trooped in from the field, she stood quickly and slipped in among them, keeping her head down and matching her movements to theirs. The guards at the force field opened a gate, and the Yibo passed through, Savina in their midst. The moment she was inside, she ducked into an alley. She was back. And this time she was back on her own terms. The Yibo back alleys were just as dangerous as any back on Colorida, but her reputation from her time with Yor must have preceded her. Once or twice she heard furtive footsteps behind her, but there was always a moment when they stopped abruptly, then disappeared. She smiled to herself. Being underestimated was her stock in trade, but still she was hunting politicians, not criminals. Although perhaps that was a distinction without a difference, and it was nice to be remembered once in a while. At last, she saw through the streets ahead of her the massive, gorgeous architecture of the government buildings. She made her way closer, staring about her like a Rim Mountain farm girl coming into the city for the first time. No one paid her any notice, which meant, probably, that whatever had happened while she was gone, the Yibo no longer saw humans as an existential threat. She had no idea whether that was a good thing or a bad one, and honestly, she didn't care. For the first time in the last however long it had been, she had no one to protect, no one to worry about, no one to lecture her on morals. She was here to kill someone, and she was good at killing people. She waited until no one was watching, then strolled casually into the broad, open courtyard surrounding the cluster of government buildings. She could recognize the building where the humans were being kept from her conversations with Inez, and she walked casually towards it as if returning after a night out. She had no idea if the humans here were being held captive, but if someone asked, she could always think of an excuse. That was the good thing about appearing so helpless and naive. No one could conceive of you actually making trouble on purpose. For a moment, she almost whispered a question for Benny into her wavelength, and then she remembered. Still, this wasn't the first time she'd had to pull a job without Benny, and it probably wouldn't be the last, assuming that any of them survived the next few weeks, of course. She found a place behind one of the old trees that lined the courtyard, abutting one of the narrow alleyways, and sat, leaning back against the tree trunk, as if taking shelter from the heat of the day. She studied the buildings through half-closed eyelids, taking note of the patterns of comings and goings as the aliens moved in and out. The air was thick, humid and warm, and insects droned lazily in the muted hum of the early morning. Despite her short nap in the cargo ship, Savina found her eyes drifting closed as she watched. She shook herself, trying to force her mind back to alertness. Just watch, and find a way in. And when she was inside, it would be a simple matter of finding this Kachik person and killing him. Then, in the confusion, she'd go after Captain Matten. She'd done this sort of thing so often she could probably do it in her sleep. An unsuspecting Yibo government official would hardly be any different than an unsuspecting human one. A hand clamped down on her shoulder. Savina spun, jerking out of her assailant's grip, too shocked to react on anything but instinct. The sun, shining directly behind the newcomer's head, left their features in shadow, and Savina blinked, trying to adjust to the light. How had she not heard them coming? She'd been tired, yes, but... Her attacker danced aside as Savina pulled out a knife, and a blow to Savina's wrist sent the weapon flying. A small warning pinged in the back of her brain, but she was too busy trying to stay alive to listen to it. She yanked out another knife, fumbling with her free hand for her pulse pistol, and barely jumped out of the way as her attacker's foot swept around, almost knocking the legs out from under her. She caught a fist to her stomach and doubled over, but managed to catch herself against the tree trunk. Her attacker leapt back as Savina's knife slashed air. For a moment, Savina and her attacker stood at the mouth of the alleyway, staring at each other. Then the warning in the back of Savina's brain finally pushed through the noise as she stared in utter bewilderment at the familiar figure in front of her. The sharp, elegant features, the rich tone of the woman's skin, a few shades darker than Savina's own, the ice in her eyes. She wasn't wearing her armored gray suit, but a loose-fitting soldier's uniform of a style Savina recognized from the scraps of fabric she'd seen on the dead bodies in the grasslands. Even the bulky uniform, though, couldn't hide the curves of her muscular body or the smooth, sensuous grace of her movements. The figure Savina had last seen crumpling to the ground, eyes wide with shock and pain, blood seeping through her fingers as she clutched at the wound from Savina's pulse pistol. The wound that should have killed her. And despite everything, despite the muddy, ugly mix of shock and guilt and horror, just like always, the sight of her sent a jolt through Savina's entire body, a confusing spike of lust and hate that she had no idea what to do with. "Reka?" she said at last, hearing the disbelief in her own tone. "How the actual hell... Upset you couldn't kill me?" Reka's mouth curved into a cool, mocking smile that made Savina shiver, in a way that was not necessarily unpleasant, but certainly unwanted. "You're quite something, Savina Moya." "You're supposed to be dead, damn you," Savina hissed. Her hands were shaking, and she wasn't sure why. She lunged at Reka again, but the woman sidestepped neatly, smirking at her. "Hush! I'd hate for anyone to hear us." Savina cursed and lunged again, and this time Reka stepped into the blow, catching Savina's arm and redirecting the force so that Savina stumbled heavily into the alley wall. She barely caught herself, then twisted, grabbing Reka's arm and yanking her forward. With a grunt of surprise, Reka stumbled, caught off balance. For a moment, Savina was too shocked to take advantage. Reka was easily strong enough to have stopped her. But she recovered quickly, grabbing Reka's hair in one hand and yanking out a knife with the other, driving it towards Reka's stomach. Reka dodged, barely, the knife skittering across the battered body armor of her uniform, and kicked out hard, catching Savina in the shin. Savina yelped, jumping back, and Reka lunged for her, but she couldn't break free of Savina's grip. Savina shoved Reka down, slamming her head painfully into the concrete, and dropped her knee onto the woman's chest, holding her in place. For a moment she sat there, panting, strangely reluctant to reach for the knife that would slit Reka's throat. "Wait!" Reka's voice was hoarse, and there was a raw edge of exhaustion and pain to it that Savina hadn't heard there before. It wasn't until then that Savina noticed the grayish cast to Reka's skin, the dark stain just visible through her uniform. For a stunned half-moment, she thought perhaps her knife had hit home after all, and the sick horror that washed over her was strong enough and shocking enough that it took her by surprise. Then her brain kicked in, and she recognized the outline of bandages on Reka's torso, the way the stains on her uniform were dried and faded, not the wet red of fresh blood. Of course. It had only been days since she'd shot Reka down on the streets of this very city, left her bleeding out on the concrete. "How are you still alive?" Savina snapped, ignoring the hoarseness in her own voice. Reka was still breathing heavily, and despite her obvious pain, despite the fact that Savina had her pinned to the ground, a knife at her throat, she still managed that look of cool disdain that Savina had seen so often in restless, unsatisfying dreams. "You think I'd let something like you kill me?" Savina's heart was pounding hard and uneven, and she could feel the ragged rise and fall of Reka's chest under her knee, the taut tendons of the woman's wrist warm between her fingers. "Well, let's see if you can survive with your jugular cut," she said at last, forcing a sweet smile. "Most people don't. But you seem to be quite extraordinary, so—" "You idiot," Reka gasped. "You were half asleep, lying there in the shade. You didn't even hear me coming. I could have shot you in the head, put a knife in your back, slit your throat from behind. I could have killed you a dozen ways." Savina tried to ignore the chill that crawled up her back at Reka's words, because Reka was right. That had been the unease tingling in the back of Savina's brain this whole time. If Reka had wanted to kill her, she'd already be dead. "Had a change of heart, then?" Savina smiled wider, letting her dimple show. "Decided I'm too pretty to kill?" Reka turned her head and spat into the street. Savina pouted. "Now you've hurt my feelings." "Believe me, Savina," said Reka, her voice hard. "I'll take great pleasure in killing you when this is all done, but in the meantime, there are more important things than your miserable life." Savina pouted again, playing the knife across the fingers of her free hand. "Reka, that's not how you flirt with a girl." Her hands, though, were shakier than they should be. Reka narrowed her eyes. "Captain Matten sent a group of soldiers with me to kill you and bring Alba back to the city. I tracked you to that agricultural planet. But I heard the soldiers talking when they didn't think I could hear. Matten plans to let the Yibo through the portal. With the Yibo's help, Kavako will stage a coup, and in return, he'll let the Yibo take whatever they want from us." She looked up at Savina with her cold, emotionless gaze. "I'd love to watch you bleed out on the pavement, Savina. But you're a nothing, an annoyance, Kavako, though. If he has the power to do it, he'll destroy the entire Joias system." Savina stared. "That was you who killed those soldiers?" she asked at last, stupidly. It made sense. Whoever had killed the human soldiers who'd followed them had more than a little practice to do it so neatly. If she hadn't bloody shot Reka herself, watched her collapse onto the street, she'd have guessed who it was immediately. "You found them, did you?" Reka's voice had regained its usual cool amusement. Savina took a deep breath, recovering her composure with an effort. "So you came all that way to kill me, and then gave up right at the finish line so you could come back and save the Joias system. You're quite the hero, aren't you? And here I thought you were just a lapdog looking for another master." Her heart was pounding. Reka had been there. Reka had been on the planet, following them. And Savina had had no idea, injured, unsuspecting. How many of them could Reka have killed if she'd wanted to? She'd killed a dozen soldiers, because they hadn't been watching for it. And nor had Savina, nor had any of them. "Kavako's damn well not going to take control of the Joias system. Not while I'm alive to stop him." There was a sharp bitterness under Reka's flat tone. Savina closed her eyes for a moment, her head spinning. So Joska had been right, after all, about the portal. Alba had been right. As much as Savina hated the Chief Justice, as much as Savina would love to see the whole Joias system implode, she'd spent enough time out in the world to know what a system with Kavako in charge of it would look like. She could practically smell the smoke of burning bodies from the vids of the holy wars she'd been forced to watch over and over as a child. Even now, years later and light years distant, the memories made her shaky. "You plan to go back with them then, kill Kavako?" she asked at last. Reka shook her head impatiently. I'm going to kill Captain Matten and that scientist Emmerich. Once they're dead, I suspect the Yibo won't be nearly as motivated to find out what's on the other side of the portal. They'll have no guarantee what's waiting for them. But if someone finds your dead body outside the government compound, it will warn Matten that something's wrong. Your life isn't worth that. What a coincidence, Savina said brightly. It just so happens I came to kill Captain Matten as well, and the Yibo head of government because why not? Although if I'd known you were still alive, I'd have put you at the top of the list. Reka narrowed her eyes. You're lying. There was a flash of anger in her gaze now that sent something savage and warm into the pit of Savina's stomach. What? Savina asked innocently. Is it so unbelievable I'm here to help? I'm really actually a very selfless person if you get to know me. Reka sucked in a quick breath, and Savina felt a hot, vicious thrill of satisfaction. I don't know what you're doing, Savina Moya, said Reka in a low voice, but I'm not going to let you ruin this like you've ruined everything else. Savina clenched her teeth against the hot burst of anger, her hand trembling on her knife. She'd been the one who ruined everything? This was stupid. She should have killed Reka the moment she had her on the ground. What the actual hell was wrong with her? But she could still see, in her mind, Reka's crumpled body in the street, blood seeping from between her fingers, still feel the sick twist of guilt and vindication at the sight. Besides, Reka was right. A body would be hard to explain. And Reka, who'd had Nicolau in her gun sights and let him go, because she didn't want to hurt an innocent bystander, Reka was stupid enough to be honorable about this whole thing. Fine, she said at last, through her teeth. We both have people we want to kill. So you go your way and I'll go mine, and when this is over... She flashed Reka her brightest smile. I would be more than happy to renew our acquaintance. Reka gave her a small smirk. I might agree to that, if you were anyone else. But you're not out of my sight until we're done this. Then, if you do a good job, maybe I'll give you a day's start. I don't know why you think... Savina began. Then she glanced down. Reka opened her fingers just enough so that Savina could see the muzzle of a small, deadly pulse pistol peeking out, pointed at Savina's stomach. Like I said, someone finding your dead body would make my job much more difficult, and I don't have time to go hide it somewhere safe, but I have no guarantee you won't try to kill me the moment I turn my back, since that seems to be your general method, so we're going together. Kachik is the one who wants to join forces with Kavako. Having him out of the way certainly won't hurt. If you really want to kill some Yibo politician, I'm sure you could use the help. And I'm sure I can kill Captain Matten, even if I'm babysitting you at the same time. Savina blinked at her in total outrage. Reka shoved Savina off her and pushed herself painfully to her feet, her gun still trained on Savina. Come on, she said, as though coaxing a stubborn pack animal. We both have the same goal for now. No, we don't, Savina snapped, too irritated to measure her words. Because my goal is making sure you don't leave the planet alive. Reka just gestured with her gun, still wearing that smirk that made Savina desperate to wipe it off. With a gun, or with a fist, of course, because there was absolutely nothing about that sensuous mouth twisted into a mocking grin, those lean, strong fingers wrapped around the butt of the pistol, that had anything to do with the sudden heat that flared in the pit of her stomach. She turned away and shoved herself to her feet, cursing her traitorous hormones. It wasn't actually fair that someone who she so utterly loathed should be so ridiculously attractive. I saw you watching the building, Reka continued, leaning casually back against the wall of the alley. Even injured as she was, her movements held a fluid grace that pulled at Savina's gaze. Savina! Are you even listening? Savina blinked up at Reka. I said the woman slowly, as if Savina was very stupid. I know how to get in. That's what you were looking for, wasn't it? Savina glared at her. Reka smiled, a cold, dangerous smile that made Savina's heart jump. She closed her eyes. This was not the state of mind she needed to be in to make a decision. Reka wanted her dead. Savina returned the sentiment. No matter how attractive Reka might be, no matter how the memory of her lying crumpled in the street might haunt Savina, as long as Reka was alive, Savina would never be safe. But, well, Reka was right. If they spent too much time out here fighting, it was inevitable they'd be discovered. And if Reka could, in fact, get them through the doors of the government building, it would make things much easier. Anyway, at some point, Reka would get sloppy. At some point, she'd forget who she was dealing with, and she'd let down her guard for just a moment. And with her weakened like this, injured and slower than usual, a moment would be all it would take. She took a deep breath and smiled up at Reka. Fine. I don't usually take on partners, but like you said, we would probably work really well together. Her voice was breathy and overly sincere. Reka's mouth tightened, and Savina was mildly gratified at the flash of irritation in the woman's eyes. It wasn't like she thought Reka would actually be fooled by the act. She was used to playing to her audience, easing them into letting down their guard. But there was something about Reka that goaded her, made her say and do things just to draw the woman's attention. It was dangerous and stupid, and she couldn't seem to help it. Reka straightened, wincing, and gestured Savina ahead of her with the tip of her weapon. "That looks like it hurt," said Savina sympathetically, glancing down at the blood staining Reka's suit. "You should probably get it looked at." "I've had worse," said Reka dryly. "This one wasn't much, just a little girl who thought she could play with the grown-ups." "I wonder where the little girl is now," said Savina, wide-eyed. "A big, tough woman like you, I'll bet she didn't stand a chance." "She won't, if she doesn't shut her damn mouth." Reka was speaking through her teeth. Savina smiled to herself and was silent. They came around the back of the building. Savina watched Reka carefully for any sign that the woman was planning to shoot her the moment her back was turned, but it seemed the idiot was stupid enough to think that the two of them could actually work together without killing each other. Savina didn't feel it necessary to disabuse her of that notion. At least, not while she was being useful. Reka led them to the back of the government compound. There was more metal than glass here, but she stepped up to a small entrance, or rather, where an entrance should have been, but instead was solid glass, and pulled out a thin device from the pocket of her jacket, holding it up to the surface. The glass dissolved. Savina glanced at her, mildly impressed. "One of the guards I killed had it on her," said Reka coolly, gesturing Savina inside. Savina stepped through, and Reka followed. "Do you know where you need to go?" asked Reka in a soft voice. The hallway was deserted, but from farther ahead Savina could hear the muted chatter of Yibo voices. She shook her head. Reka's look turned to one of disdain. "So, you plan to just wander in here and hope you stumbled across him?" Savina smiled. "No, I didn't need to do that, because I can understand what they're saying." She reveled for just a moment in the startled look on Reka's face. Then she moved ahead, Reka close behind. Chapter 9. Alba. By midday, Joska and Josip between them had made the necessary arrangements. "As long as you do not overexert yourself, you should suffer no ill effects from this," the doctor said in stilted common dialect. "I will send a transport drone to assist you, so you don't have to put too much weight on your leg." Alba nodded stiffly. "Thank you." With Joska's assistance and the assistance of the Yibo transport drone, Alba made her painful way down the potholed streets of the village. She looked around her as she walked. The village was small and neat, but it carried a very different flavor from that of the city they'd left. There was a force field around the village, just like there had been around the jungle city, and under the force field, the streets were lined with spreading trees, the burst of green contrasting sharply with the yellow-brown of the prairie grasslands outside. The buildings here were less elegant and soaring. Presumably, the wind of this place would make the tall, graceful architectural style a liability, but Alba could see hints of the same style in the oddly refractive clear walls of the buildings, and the way they stretched out in delicate branches along the ground. The similarities, however, ended there. Rather than the sleek, modern, glass and steel look of the Yibo government buildings, these were decorated with brightly colored accents, the roofs of a thick red tile, the metal struts holding the glass-like material together, painted or stained in cheerful oranges and yellows and greens, and decorated with closely dotted designs that spread in organic loops and whirls up the sides of the buildings and faded into the glass. Small, large-eyed youngsters shouted and played in the streets, kicking makeshift balls in a game that was oddly reminiscent of the children's games back on the streets of Vila Nova do Sol. The more timid among them ducked back at the sight of the newcomers, but the bolder ones stared at them openly, chattering to each other in words too quick for even Inez's translator, set into Alba's wavelength, to pick up. Again, Alba felt that strange twist of unease at the unquestioning acceptance by the Yibo of humans in their midst. She pushed it back, resolutely. There would be time to worry about that once they'd neutralized the threat to the Joias System. At last, they reached a small, cozy-looking building, the walls bordered by blue, patterned struts, and Joska paused at the entrance, gesturing her inside. "I'll be helping Nicolau and Benny and Inez in the fields, it sounds like," the woman said in her comfortable, wry tone. "But Josip and Felju will be working with you. I expect they're already inside." Alba nodded stiffly, letting go of Joska's arm, and limped painfully through the doorway. With the transparent walls, there was hardly a change in the brightness from outside to inside. Still, she had to blink for a moment at the change from the glare of the sun to the softly refracted light inside the building. She glanced around her at the group of a dozen or so Yibo in the small sitting room. They stared back with undisguised suspicion. They all looked older, although it was hard to tell with Yibo, grayish tips to the fur around their mouths and eyes, movements that bore the caution of age rather than the recklessness of youth. Their clothing was the same as she'd seen of the other villagers, tunics and trousers, the cloth worked in the same organic patterns as the designs on the buildings. None of them looked happy to see her. She sighed, fighting back her irritation. She was likely the only person who wanted her there less than the Yibo did, but somewhere a few million kilometers away, Kachik and Captain Matten were discussing how her home system would be parceled out between them, and if she failed to stop it, she would not let it be because she'd refused to put in the effort. The chairs were gathered in small clusters with a spreading, tree-like structure in the center, from which were hung various trays of what Alba assumed must be food and drink. Bolts of material were piled on the floor around the chairs, and delicate hand-guided drones perched on top of the piles like tiny hummingbirds. One of the Yibo gestured grudgingly toward one of the ubiquitous, uncomfortable stools that seemed to be set aside specifically for humans, and, biting back a groan, Alba made her hobbling way over and lowered herself gingerly down onto it. Human. Alba looked up, startled, into the face of an older Yibo woman. "Yes," she answered tartly. "I asked, human, if you know what you're doing." Alba took a deep breath. After 73 years of never permitting herself to show either doubt or uncertainty, admitting her own ignorance was almost a painful thing. "I do not," she said, raising her chin slightly. The Yibo woman looked down at her condescendingly. "Well then, move over. I'll show you. We don't have time or resources to waste picking out badly made pieces." Alba bit back a sharp retort as the woman sat beside her, muttering something in Yibo that Alba's wavelength translated. "I truly did not understand how useless humans could be," the woman was saying under her breath. "After all the stories about helpful, willing humans, I'll tell you, I don't see it. As far as I'm concerned, we should have just taken that ship rather than bargain for their help to work off the debt, for all the use they're going to be." "You never know," said another of the Yibo mildly, glancing up. "It's possible they'll learn. This one seems stubborn, but the man who works with her is friendly enough. That captain and those 3 kids are hard workers, whatever else you want to say about them. They're helping out with the harvesting, and it didn't take them long to catch on," said another. "I don't have a lot of hope for this one learning anything useful." The speaker gestured derisively at Alba, but the others might make up for it. Alba had to actually bite her lip to hold back an irritated rejoinder. She was accustomed to being the most important person in the room, and she hadn't realized until just now how much she'd gotten used to it. But it couldn't be helped. She set her mouth in a grim line and set about copying her guide's stitches. It was an intricate, painstaking process. Tiny drones did the actual stitching, but you needed to manually steer them to create the patterns. The Yibo hadn't trusted Alba with creating the patterns herself, with some justice, she was forced to admit, instead giving her cloth with the patterns traced onto it in light markings that she was expected to follow, but the work of keeping the drone moving correctly was far from simple. Alba's hands, still shaky and weak from her injuries, kept bumping the drone clumsily, and she had to send it back to unpick the stitches so often that by the time the other workers in the circle had finished a small pile of clothing, she was still only halfway done her first. Josip, sitting across from her, seemed to be having much less difficulty, his calloused hands moving the drone in sure patterns. He was deep in conversation with a Yibo man, and judging from the man's wide smile, they were having a delightful time despite their lack of shared language. Feliu sat stiffly nearby, but as Alba watched, Josip turned, drawing him skillfully into the conversation. "You look like you could use a hand," said one of the Yibo women in accented common dialect, coming to sit beside her, the same woman who'd spoken up for Alba at the beginning. She sat down beside her, and Alba fought back the urge to jerk her project away in irritation. "I'm her." She took a deep breath, instead, and resisted the instinct to snatch her hands back when the Yibo woman guided them along the outline of the fabric. "Are we going to do when Kachik sends patrols next?" Alba looked up in surprise, glancing over at the speaker. She was one of the older women, her head down as she spun the stitching drone in intricate patterns on the cloth. The man across from her snorted, holding up his own finished garment to inspect. "We do what we've always done. Not like we can afford to get on the bad side of Kachik, but we can't afford to get on the bad side of the government either." Alba frowned. "Careful! You've got to pay attention, or the lines will be crooked." Alba looked back to her work, biting back the flare of irritation at her companion's indulgent smile. "What are they talking about?" she asked, trying to make her words casual. The woman shrugged. "Taxes. With the system like it is, everyone wants to tax everyone, Kachik and Ira both. And since we're halfway between Chir and Priya..." Alba raised an eyebrow. "What's Priya?" She could still see, in her mind's eye, the map that Kachik had shown her back in the Yibo city, the image she'd captured on her wavelink. She was quite certain she hadn't seen a planet or a city by that name. The woman gave a soft, comfortable hum of amusement. "I wouldn't expect you to know much about the system yet, seeing as you're humans. Came through the portal, I hear?" "Yes," murmured Alba. Her mind was racing. "As far as I'm concerned," said a man from the other side of the room as Alba's wavelink translated, "we could just declare loyalties." The older woman who'd first spoken smiled. "Not likely. We're a bunch of farmers. You know what they think about us. Stupid and unsophisticated. I'm not about to disabuse them of that, if it means we still have enough to go around. Even enough to take care of these humans." Someone else hummed softly. "The advantage of the people who make the decisions not having any idea how much a single agricultural season should produce." "Back to my question," said the first speaker. "You say do what we've always done?" The older woman nodded. "We'll hide some of the designs in the warehouse again. As long as we're here sewing, I doubt they'll worry about checking there. And if they do, we can always say it was a shipment that got returned or something. Do Kachik's people come here frequently?" Alba asked in a low voice, trying to keep her hand steady on the machine. The woman beside her shrugged. "Frequently enough, after all. After what happened the last time they opened..." She paused, glancing sideways at Alba, and trailed off. Alba turned resolutely back to her work. But it was mildly disorienting, looking around at the old, obviously rural Yibo as they chattered and gossiped and, it appeared, strategized how to keep their village from both Kachik and Ira, whoever or whatever that was. "All we need now is for the raiders to show up," said one of the women. "With how our luck's been these last few months..." There was a communal clicking of tongues and shaking of heads and... "Stop worrying. I doubt we'll get into trouble," said Her comfortably. "Last time a raider party came close, I told Captain Krivai that if he didn't call it off, I was worried that we wouldn't have enough people to finish off his last order." she chuckled. He got his people to deal with the problem, and they dealt with it quickly. She paused, turning back to Alba and switching to common dialect. Oops, like I said, you have to watch. We'll have to pick those stitches out again. Alba turned numbly back to her work, her mind spinning. By the end of the day, Alba was exhausted, her hands stiff and aching, her back sore from bending over the drones. When she pushed herself to her feet and stumbled wearily to the exit, she was struck with an unexpected relief at the sight of Josip waiting for her, his eyes twinkling, his smile wide and friendly. Alba, he said, if you'll forgive me for saying it, you look tired. Shall we walk together? She could hear the words he wasn't saying. You look exhausted. I'm not sure you'll make it back on your own. But he was right, and she had neither the energy nor the willpower to stand on her dignity at the moment. So she walked home between Josip, with his easy smile and his light conversation, and Feliu, quiet, but smiling reluctantly at Josip's words. Alba? Josip asked at last, turning his smile on her. How did you enjoy your first knitting circle to save the system? She blinked at him for a moment, pulled out of her spiraling thoughts. I suppose now they'll have to add Yibo knitting as a prerequisite to Joias civil servant positions, Feliu muttered. Alba stared, and then she let out an undignified snort of laughter. Josip joined in wholeheartedly, and even Feliu gave a reluctant chuckle. And for no reason she could fathom, there was a breathless relief that washed through her at the sound of their laughter, as if the fate of the system no longer rested on her shoulders alone, as if, Yibo knitting circle and all, it was possible that they could fix this. Chapter 10. Aran. By the time the sun had set, Aran was stumbling with exhaustion, and Istve was barely on their feet. At some point during the afternoon, the two of them had switched from their typical trail formation to walking side by side, Aran's arm around Istve's back, Istve's over Aran's shoulder. It spoke to how dire the situation had become that Istve hardly protested. Their face was set in a stoic mask that told Aran just how much effort it was taking them merely to stay on their feet. The forest around the two of them hadn't cleared. If anything, it had gotten thicker. The gradient of the ground had started out as a steady rise and fall of gentle hills, but it was gradually sharpening into the steeper peaks and valleys that, if Aran was any judge, meant foothills. The trees were thick enough, though, that he couldn't get a good view of the terrain ahead, so the best he could do was guess, and hope like hell he and Istve didn't run straight into the mountains. Ani alternated between ghosting noiselessly along beside them through the trees, and huddling in a worried lump on Aran's shoulder, completely enveloping Istve's hand and forearm, and reaching out occasionally to stroke Istve's shoulder or face with the tip of a tentacle. As the last glowing rays of the sun cut across the gathering dimness, Aran glanced over at Istve, stumbling along with their eyes half closed. If there were mountains ahead, it was doubtful either of them would make it up. The dusk turned to dark, and at last Aran stumbled to a halt, glancing around to get his bearings. Istve slumped against him, too weary even to pretend to be all right. He sighed, trying to hold back his concern. Pishti, he said quietly. Pishti, we'll rest here for a bit. Istve tried to raise their head. I'll be fine, they mumbled. Just let me... Their words trailed off, as if they were too weary to finish the sentence. No, said Aran, looking around quickly. We haven't heard the raiders behind us in a while. Maybe they lost the trail. Anyways, if we keep going like this, we're going to get so sloppy that they find us anyways. Best to find a place to sleep for the night, I think. If they can't track us by scent, they'll need to follow our trail by sight. And even if they have night vision, that'll be easier in daylight. I doubt they'll risk missing us in the dark. He expected Istve to protest, but they just nodded wearily. His chest tight with worry, Aran lowered his friend carefully to the forest floor, propping them up against the trunk of one of the evergreen trees. Ani, watch Istve, he whispered, and she slithered down his arm to take her place on Istve's lap, her entire body a bright, concerned purple, her eye pouches puffed out. He watched the two of them for a moment, biting his lip in concern, then stepped away quickly to scout for a place to shelter. It was almost full dark by the time he found something. A tree had fallen over, and the roots pulled up to create a small dirt cave that was almost invisible unless you were right up next to it. By the time he returned, Istve was slumped back against the tree, eyes closed. Ani huddled beside them, growling her soft, worried growl, and when he bent and put a hand on his friend's arm, he could feel them shivering, their skin cold to the touch. He swore helplessly. There was no way he could make a fire. Not here, not when he and Istve were being tracked by creatures who hunted by smell. He crouched down and hauled Istve to their feet, biting his lip against the panic, and Ani scrambled up his trouser leg. He wasn't sure if Istve was even fully conscious during the short, nightmarish trek through the trees to the shelter, their feet stumbling, Aran supporting their full weight. When the three of them finally reached it, Aran pulled the survival kit from his knapsack, yanking out the compact, self-inflating mat that should at least protect Istve from the worst of the cold seeping up through the ground. It wasn't anything approaching the cold of a Rim Mountain winter, but the night air held the familiar bite of mountain chill. He hauled his semi-conscious friend onto the mat, then carefully checked them over with the tiny emergency med scanner. Despite the cuts and bruises that were already purpling garishly across their arms and shoulders, and the mess of swelling and dried blood on their face, they didn't seem to have broken any bones. And, if they had a concussion, which they probably did, there really wasn't much Aran could do about it at the moment. He laid Istve out as comfortably as he could and covered them with both the thin emergency blankets. After a moment of hesitation, he crawled in beside them, adding his body heat to theirs, and Ani plopped down on top of them both like a small, lumpy, tentacled coverlet. Istve was completely unconscious at this point, their eyes closed and their body limp, but as the blanket slowly warmed around them, they mumbled something incoherent and snuggled in closer, burrowing into the warmth formed by Aran's body. Aran tightened his arm around them, and just for one moment, as he closed his eyes, he allowed himself to wish, hopelessly, for what might have been. Then even that wasn't enough, and his exhausted body gave up completely, and he was asleep. When Aran woke the next morning, the first traces of sunlight were trickling in through the tangle of tree roots above them. He groaned softly as he blinked his eyes open. His entire body was sore, his neck and back painfully stiff, his leg aching from the crash, and then the forced march of the entire previous day. Every part of him felt bruised and battered, except for the comfortable warmth against his chest. He turned and saw Istve curled into him. Their eyes were closed, their dark lashes brushing their cheeks, their face a gruesome pattern of bruises against an unhealthy pallor. But even so, something about the sight hit Aran like a punch to the stomach. Istve moaned. Their eyelids fluttered open and they blinked up at Aran. Their eyes went wide. Aran was suddenly very, very aware that he was lying practically on top of them and that he could feel every centimeter of their body under his, their wiry muscles, the shape of them and the warmth of them, and damn it to hell, his brain had figured out that this was not a relationship that was ever going to happen, but apparently his body hadn't got the memo, and everything inside him was turning into a sort of helpless, fuzzy mess. Istve was still staring up at him, still with that expression on their face. "Aran," they said softly, and something in the tone of their voice made Aran's heart jump. He swallowed hard. Pishti, I'm sorry, you were cold last night, and I was worried about you, and—" "Aran," whispered Istve again, their voice husky. Their hand came up, brushing Aran's cheek, and suddenly he couldn't do it anymore. He pulled back abruptly. Istve's hand fell to their side. "Listen," Aran began, although his voice didn't seem to want to work the way it ought to. "Listen, Pishti, you don't have to do this. I know you don't want a relationship. I've known that for a long time. But before I was being stupid and selfish, and I wouldn't let it die. And that's my fault, but I'm not doing that anymore. You don't have to pretend just to make me feel better, okay?" He closed his eyes and ran his hands over his face. We're friends, and that's all, and it's all right. I'm not looking for anything more, I promise. He opened his eyes again and managed a small smile. Istve was still staring at him, their face going through a rapid range of emotions that he couldn't read and, quite frankly, didn't want to. I promise, Pishti, he mumbled, turning away. You really don't have to pretend. It's fine. You're my best friend, and you always will be, and look, I'm sorry for making things awkward before. He could feel Istve's eyes on the back of his head. There was a long moment of silence. Aran. There was an unfamiliar note in Istve's voice, and Aran's stomach twisted in embarrassment. He half turned and managed a pained smile. Pishti, please. I don't really want to talk about it right now. He turned and slid out the entrance to the cave, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. At last, he straightened carefully and glanced around. Ani must have taken up watch just outside the cave, because a moment later she dropped down beside him in a small shower of leaves and chirruped up at him pitifully. He leaned down with a small, rueful smile and picked her up, stroking her absently as she cuddled against his chest. At the very least, they'd survived the night. The first rays of morning sun were peeking through the tree branches, casting bright streaks of orange light across the ground through the trees. The air smelled fresh and clean, and despite everything that had happened back in the stupid cave, Aran found his smile growing a little more genuine. It was better like this anyways. It was better to finally talk about it, finally get it out in the open. And maybe, finally, the awkwardness would go away and things could go back to being comfortable again. Istve could finally feel comfortable again. From behind him, he heard the rustle of someone exiting the cave. He stiffened, but didn't turn around. Istve's footsteps came up behind him and their hand landed on his shoulder. He stiffened more. Aran? Said Istve, still with that strange note in their voice. I packed our things into the knapsack. Normally, I'd say maybe we should just lay low and hope they miss us, but they proved pretty thoroughly yesterday that they can follow a trail as long as they have the light to do it, so we'll need to keep moving. We'll have to have the energy bars for breakfast and probably dinner too, but at least they should have enough calories to... They trailed off. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence. At last, Istve cleared their throat and shoved an energy bar into Aran's hand. You should eat something. You'll feel better after you've eaten. I wasn't the only one who got beat up in that crash, and you've been doing most of the work, hauling me after you, so... They trailed off again. About what you said back there. Aran gritted his teeth. Look, Pishti, can we please not talk about this right now? I'm not sure I can... The sharp crack of a twig made both of their heads jerk around as if they were two puppets pulled by the same string, and Ani gave a low growl, her eye pouches puffing out. Aran's eyes met Istve's, every trace of lingering awkwardness replaced with grim realization. I'll grab the pack, said Aran. We've got to get out of here, now. By the time the sun was fully up, they were on the run again. The day passed in a haze of exhaustion and strain. Istve's strength began to give out by midday, and, between Aran's own injuries and the fact that he was all but carrying Istve as well, by the time the sun began to set, he could barely put one foot in front of the other. The pursuit hadn't flagged throughout the day, and more than once they'd only escaped by the sheerest of luck. And now... Aran stared at the steep slope ahead of them in blank despair. Aran, what is it? Istve mumbled, opening their eyes with an effort. I was right, said Aran grimly. Those were foothills. He gestured at the foot of the mountain ahead of them, the evergreens clinging to the side of the steep slope. Istve groaned. I don't suppose there's a way around it? Aran shook his head. No such luck. Even if there was, there's no way we get around this, not being chased like we are. And from the sounds of it, they've spread out. It feels like they're trying to cut us off. We can't turn off, or they'll catch us. Istve swore, and something about the hopelessness in their tone caught in Aran's chest. Aran, they began softly. Shut up, said Aran in a flat voice. Don't even damn well think about it. Istve sighed. Aran, listen, They broke off, their voice catching. I can't make it up this. Do you think I don't realize you're practically carrying me as it is? There's no way both of us get up the mountain, so at least one of us should... I said shut up! Istve sighed and fell silent. In the distance, Aran could hear the sound of the raiders pushing through the trees behind them. Ani shifted on his shoulder, growling uneasily. The raiders hadn't caught up yet, but it wouldn't take long. He turned back to the steep slope ahead of them. Well, said Istve at last, and Aran could hear the utter exhaustion in their tone. I guess we'd better get going. Aran took a deep breath. I'm going to carry you, okay? Istve scowled at him. I'm not going to let you. The footsteps were getting closer. We don't bloody have time to argue, Aran snapped, and Istve sighed. Fine, they said wearily. Fine, we'll do it your way. Ani reached out a tentacle to pull herself off Aran's shoulders and onto an adjoining tree branch as Aran crouched, hoisting Istve onto his back, and straightened with an effort. He tried to hide his stagger, glancing over his shoulder quickly. From the look on Istve's face, he wasn't sure he'd been successful, but they didn't say anything, and Aran stumbled forward up the grade. He hadn't gone more than 100 meters before he was panting, his legs almost ready to give out. He was holding Istve in place with one hand, and with the other halfway dragging himself up the slope, supporting himself on the branches of the ubiquitous evergreens. Behind him he heard a shout, and he swore breathlessly as more voices joined in. Damn it! They'd been spotted. Ani hissed a threat from the trees above him, but even she wouldn't be able to take on that many raiders. He tried to pull himself along faster, but his muscles were shaking with the effort, his breath rasping in his throat. Maybe if he could get far enough up the mountain, he and Ani could turn and make a stand at least long enough to distract them from Istve. Behind him, someone shouted again, and the footsteps came to an abrupt halt. Aran didn't have time to worry about it, or to do anything but mutter a brief, semi-coherent gasp of gratitude to whoever or whatever was helping them out. At last, the steep slope flattened into a shallow ledge, and he came to a halt, gasping for air. Aran, said Istve quietly. What is it? He panted. They've turned around. They're not following us anymore. Aran leaned against a tree, closing his eyes for a moment as he caught his breath. Are you sure? He asked, when his breathing had steadied a bit. Look, said Istve. There was a grim note to their voice. Aran looked. From this height, he could see for some distance. Far out, he could make out the smoking ruins of what had once been their escape pod, their only way off this planet. But below them, in the trees, he could see nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Down a slope like this, as steep as it was, he should be able to see or hear something if the raiders were still after them. Even Ani had stopped hissing, and she dangled from the tree beside him, her posture watchful but relaxed. Maybe they decided to come around and cut us off from the other side, said Aran, trying to push back the unease in his stomach. I'm sure they know the terrain better than we do. Istve shook their head. Maybe, but I have a feeling it's something else. You're carrying me and I'm completely useless. There's no way they didn't realize they could make it up this mountain faster than we could. Aran glanced ahead of them up the slope. In the darkening evening, the mountain seemed to stretch to the sky. For one brief, ridiculous moment, he felt a touch of what could only be called homesickness, memories of the rim mountains pushing themselves into his brain. Memories of a time when Istve wasn't dying. But he'd only been fooling himself. Istve had been dying that whole time. He just hadn't realized. Put me down, said Istve, their voice cracked with weariness. You're about to fall over. If they're not coming up after us, we may as well rest. Goodness knows we both need it, they added in an undertone. Let's get a little farther first. Aran could hardly make himself say the words, his entire body rebelling against the thought of climbing even one more step. but he and Istve were still much too close to where the raiders had left off chasing them. If they were going to hide, he'd rather it be somewhere that wasn't quite so obvious. For a moment, he thought Istve would argue, but they just nodded wearily. Aran struggled up the mountain until it was almost too dark to see, his muscles shaking, his stomach roiling with nausea from the effort. The next time the slope flattened off, it was almost full dark. Wearily, he lowered Istve to the ground, and then dropped to his knees and tried not to vomit. He and Istve slept back to back in a small hollow beneath the spreading lower branches of a tree, Ani pressing herself into the narrow space between them. Aran was unreasonably grateful when Istve simply crawled onto the mat and closed their eyes, without trying to revisit the conversation of that morning. It might be a while before Aran felt ready to go down that particular track again. His sleep was broken and uneasy. He kept waking to imagined sounds from outside, his heart pounding, and each time it took him far too long to fall back asleep. In the end, Istve woke before he did in the morning. He rolled over, blinking awake to the beam of sunlight across his face, and felt a momentary jolt of panic at glancing over to find them gone. He took a long breath, trying to slow his heart rate, and finally, his muscles aching at the movement, crawled out from under the spreading branches of the shelter. Istve was standing silhouetted against the rising sun, and they turned as Aran straightened. "They're gone," they said quietly. "Either that, or they found a way to be a hell of a lot sneakier than they were yesterday." Aran nodded silently, looking up towards the formidable bulk of the mountain. Istve voiced his thoughts for him. "If there's something up there the raiders are afraid of—" "You never know," said Aran, trying desperately not to think about the implications of Istve's words. "It could be just, I don't know, superstition or something, a religious thing. You know as well as I do that most superstitions have some basis, in fact," Istve muttered. Aran sighed. "Well, it's not like we have much choice. We can't exactly go back the way we came, not unless we want to be eaten." Istve turned and managed a weak grin. "I guess you're right. At least you won't be literally carrying me up the damn mountain this time." "There's that," Aran murmured. Istve sighed and turned back to the slope ahead of them, a grim look on their face. "Well, like you say, it's not like we have much of a choice." Chapter 11. Savina. Savina and Reka crept down the halls of the government building, keeping to the shadows, inasmuch as there were shadows in a place made mostly of windows. Savina glanced at Reka occasionally, but to her surprise, it seemed the woman actually intended to leave her alive until they both finished killing their marks, which was gratifying, if ridiculously naive. "At this time of day, Kachik will most likely be in the afternoon ministerial meetings," Reka whispered. "You're lucky one of us knows where those are." Savina shot her a glare, and Reka raised an eyebrow in that infuriating calm amusement. The two of them made their way silently through the hallways and, with Reka's device, up a set of odd lifts that brought them to one of the higher floors. Savina glanced out the window and wished abruptly that she hadn't. It wasn't that she was afraid of heights, but standing 6 stories above the ground on a translucent surface wasn't the best way to deal with them, in her opinion. Reka was watching her, still with that hint of amusement under her emotionless expression. Savina scowled and stepped back. "Come on," Reka whispered. "You can sightsee later." She gestured Savina ahead of her down a hallway. At last, they turned down a long corridor that ended in a blank, semi-translucent wall that blocked their way into what appeared to be a large room filled with Yibo. Reka ducked into a small side corridor, and Savina followed suit, trying to appear nonchalant. "All right," whispered Reka. "When we go in, Kachik will probably be sitting in the center of the room." She paused a moment. "Do you know what he looks like?" Savina's scowl must have been answer enough, because she sighed heavily. "It's a good thing for you that I found you," she said. "You would have just marched in there and started shooting. Was that your plan?" "No," snapped Savina. "My plan was to sit outside and observe, listen in, figure out who he was and where he'd be. Then I was going to wander in here, looking lost, get myself into the right room, and shoot him dead. But that was before someone forced me into helping her do the job she couldn't do alone. Reka paused a moment, biting her lip. Savina looked away quickly, cursing herself. I would have done it differently, but your plan isn't as bad as I would have expected, Reka said at last. All right, I know what Kachik looks like, and you don't, so you go over there. Look stupid and confused. That seems to be your specialty. And while the guards are watching you, I'll kill them. Slip inside and kill Kachik. It won't take the Yibo long to call in the army once Kachik's dead, so we'll have to move quickly after that. You follow me to where Kavako's people are stationed, since you have no idea where that is. You can hold off the guards again, distract them, shoot them, I don't care, and I'll take out the captain and Emmerich and as many of the soldiers as I can manage. But we'll have to get there before the Yibo have time to lock it down, or it'll be impossible. And once you've killed everyone you want to kill? Asked Savina, turning back to her. I assume you have a plan for afterwards? Reka shot her an amused glance. You're quite the optimist if you think we'll be alive to have plans after that. Savina smiled, narrowing her eyes. You should know something about me, Reka. I don't do suicide missions. I don't do anything that doesn't leave me better off than when I started. Reka gave a small, dry chuckle. Of course. You wouldn't, would you? Do your best, then, I suppose. She gave an indifferent shrug. If we both survive, I'll try to kill you. But it's always possible, since I'm the only one of us who actually gives a damn about what happens to the Joias system, that you might get off free and clear, and then you can go right on murdering your way across the system. Savina looked up to make some cutting rebuttal, and found herself caught in Reka's gaze. There was an intensity in the woman's eyes, something sharp and intelligent and relentless, and it cut through Savina like a knife. She swallowed hard and tore her gaze away, pulling out her pulse pistol and checking to make sure her knives were loose in their sheaths. Fine, she snapped. Are you ready? Reka gave a brusque nod and straightened, the movement as fluid and graceful as a jewel-backed adder uncoiling in the sun. I'll follow you, she whispered. Savina took a deep breath, straightening her tunic and mussing her hair artfully. She widened her eyes and stepped out into the corridor, looking around dazedly, her steps hesitant. The guards at the door saw her a moment later and turned, annoyance in their postures. I'm sorry, I was just... Savina began in a nervous, breathless tone. One of the guards' eyes widened, and then they collapsed to the ground with a strangled noise. Savina fought the urge to whip around. She hadn't even heard Reka behind her. How was that possible? As a second guard gave a shout of alarm. 2 more guards fell, screaming, and the others were bringing their weapons to bear in panicked confusion. Good. Reka's voice hissed in her ear, and Savina had to fight, not to jump. Scream or something. I doubt they'll try to hurt you. Savina opened her mouth to comply, and then a sound from behind her made her stomach lurch. There were footsteps from the corridors, and barked commands in the Yibo language. Dozens of footsteps. Many more than the number of guards there should have been. She spun on Reka, opening her mouth to shout something at the woman's betrayal, but Reka looked as shocked as she felt. For an instant, the 2 women stared at each other. I'll take the ones coming in. You finish off the guards, Savina hissed through her teeth. Alarms wailed, footsteps pounding out from every corridor. Savina fired and fired and fired again, but the Yibo kept coming, more than a dozen, more than 2 dozen, more than 5 dozen. She ducked a shot and yanked her knives out, sending them through the throat or shoulder or stomach of the approaching Yibo. The Yibo soldiers screamed as the knives found their marks, but even as they stumbled and fell, more came behind them. There were so many more than there should have been. From behind her, she could hear Reka's steady fire, picture the set look on the woman's face. But the guards kept coming. They kept coming, and no matter how many of them Savina shot, there were more. Something hit her full in the chest, and she staggered back at the impact, waiting for her mind to register the pain. Then it did, and she gasped, weaving on her feet. Another impact. She felt her legs give out under her, her knees slamming into the hard floor. She heard, faintly behind her, Reka's alarmed shout, but everything was blurred and unsteady. She tried to lift her hand, tried to pull the trigger on her gun, but her muscles wouldn't respond, and her movements felt thick and slow. And then the wavering shapes, the noise and the shouting around her faded, and the last thing she remembered was the floor coming up to meet her. When Savina woke, it was to a bright burst of pain. She groaned, trying to make sense of what had happened. Her entire body ached, and her face throbbed, her nose swollen and dried blood crusted down her face, which meant, probably, that she was alive at least. She'd been with Reka, and then she'd fainted, been knocked out somehow, more likely, and now she shifted experimentally. She appeared to be sitting upright, which meant she must be propped up against something. Her hands were bound behind her, and there was a cramp in her neck where her head had been slumped to one side. She sifted through her muddy memories. She must have been moved recently, which would explain the jolt of pain. Her ribs felt as though she'd been kicked hard, and the bruises had stiffened, but there was nothing to indicate serious injury, which was something of a surprise. She couldn't remember much of what had happened, but she had the vague recollection that it had involved people shooting. Well, not people per se, but Yibo, and more of them than she'd expected, and the memories came crashing back, and she had to bite back a whimper. She was going to be killed. There was no way out this time. She'd used up all her luck, and now she was going to die, and Benny and the others would never even know what had happened to her. This was supposed to have been a simple job. She took a deep breath. The Yibo had had a chance to kill her, and they hadn't done it, which meant they'd underestimated her, which meant maybe she still had a chance. Carefully, she blinked her eyes open. She was in a brightly lit cell of sorts, propped against a wall, and there were Yibo guards at the door. They had weapons trained on her, but their postures were casual, and they obviously didn't think she'd pose a threat. Reka was tied next to her, still unconscious, her head slumped on her chest. For a quick, ridiculous moment, worry clenched in Savina's stomach. Then Reka groaned and stirred, and Savina let out a breath of relief. Reka's eyes fluttered open, and she glanced around quickly. Savina could see the sharp calculation in her expression as she took in the room, their surroundings. And then Reka stiffened. Reka Soler. The voice spoke common dialect in a sing-song Yibo accent, tone amused, and Savina jerked her head around to find the speaker. He stood in one corner, his outfit fine enough that she could guess he was someone important. Captain Matten warned me you'd gone rogue. He told me to watch out for you. I suspect, the Yibo man added, a hint of humor in his voice, that he was more concerned that I find you before you killed him than he was for my well-being. He straightened, watching Reka as if she was a fascinating new specimen. I am a politician, which means I'm adept at reading the truth through the lies. And I suspect that you hate General Kavako, and by extension our good captain, very, very much. Reka didn't respond, but Savina could see the faint stiffening of her posture, and she knew the Yibo could see it as well. I don't blame you, he said, crossing the room towards them. I'm sure there's a very good reason for your dislike, but I need the captain, so I can't let you kill him. Still, the Yibo man paused. I don't see why you hating Kavako is worthy of a death sentence. Don't bother, Kachik. Reka's voice held that cold, calm matter-of-factness that Savina was so familiar with. I won't work with Captain Matten, and I won't work with General Kavako. So, she shrugged, her mouth twisted into a small, bleak smile, you may as well kill me now. The Yibo made a soft hum of amusement. You're just as fierce as those humans told me you'd be, but I think you're missing an option. He stopped in front of Reka and leaned in closer. The other option is, Matten never knows you were here. Matten never finds out I caught you trying to sneak into our meeting. You hate Kavako. I need him for the moment, but I know nothing about him, other than what Matten has told me. I have no guarantee that he will keep his end of the bargain once we have allowed him into power. From what I've heard of him, he's not one to share power easily. You, though, you could change that dynamic. He paused a moment, a small, close-lipped smile on his face. You're exactly as deadly as Captain Matten said you were. You killed almost a full company of my guards, even taken by surprise as you were. You can give me information on Kavako that Matten is hesitant to share. And if Kavako should try to walk away from the terms of his agreement, I have no doubt of your capabilities or your lethality. So that's the other option, Reka. You remain here as my guest. You and I work out a plan to keep Kavako honest. You have the satisfaction of knowing that Captain Matten will be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his time here, waiting for you to slip in through his window and cut his throat. If things go well, at worst, you're back to your own system, free and clear. And if things don't go well and Kavako tries to betray me, then you take your revenge, kill Kavako, and we replace him with someone more cooperative. I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that, but from what I know of humans, you are exceptionally arrogant and ambitious, and you have a tendency to think more of yourselves than you really deserve. Reka said nothing, her lips pinched tightly shut, but Savina could see the tension in her posture. The Yibo man turned his attention on Savina. Now that he was focused on her, Savina could study him more closely. He was average-sized for a Yibo, his fur a sort of honey brown, with gray on the tips that she'd learned meant he was older. His tail was draped neatly over his arm, and the tunic he wore was clearly finely made. The circles around his eyes were dark brown, contrasting with the golden color of his fur, and Savina assumed that by Yibo standards he was probably attractive, although in honesty she had no idea and didn't want to. He was watching her, his head cocked to one side, as if she was a puzzle he was trying to figure out. She found she was shaking, a sharp, bitter taste of fear in the back of her throat, but she widened her eyes, letting the hint of tears start in their corners. She had years of practice of bringing tears on demand. You, though, the Yibo man mused, I have no idea who you are, and that could pose a problem. Savina drew in a shuddering little breath, dropping her head as if trying to compose herself. Reka is my lover. It was the first thing that had popped into her head, and she was going to die anyways, so it hardly seemed to matter. She told me she was doing this, and I couldn't let her do it alone. I knew it was dangerous, and I couldn't bear for her to die without me. She broke off, her voice choking, and squeezed her eyes shut as if fighting back tears. I couldn't wait back with the others and not know whether she was alive or... She sniffled loudly and watched through her lowered lashes as the Yibo's posture relaxed just a little, and tried not to think about how much of the shakiness in her voice was affected and how much was genuine. From the corner of her eye, she could see Reka's glare, the fury in it hot enough to scald, and she felt a trace of sick satisfaction, even through the fear. She was going to die anyways. May as well get in one last jab. Kachik hummed in amusement, still watching her. Somehow, I doubt that. Matten told me that Reka was working alone. So, I'll ask you again. Who are you? There was an unspoken threat in his mild tone, a soft viciousness that made Savina's stomach clench. I told you, Savina tried again. Her mouth was dry. Kachik gestured to a guard. The Yibo woman stepped forward, raising her pistol, and Savina shrank back. This is your last chance, said Kachik pleasantly, and then she'll shoot you. Savina strained her fingers, reaching for one of her hidden knife blades, but they were all out of reach. Her words choked in her throat. The soldier stepped forward. She's telling the truth. Savina's head jerked up in concert with Kachik's and the soldier's. I'm sorry, what did you say? Asked Kachik, turning back to Reka. She's telling the truth. She's my lover. Reka was speaking through clenched teeth, not looking at Savina. Savina stared. And you let her come with you? Asked Kachik, that hint of amusement back in his tone. Reka took a deep breath, her posture relaxing once more, her usual unflappable calm reasserting itself. It was no use trying to stop her. There's no talking sense into her when she's come up with an idea. But then, she always needs protecting, so I'm used to it. Reka gave a low, soft chuckle that did something to Savina's insides. She's a pretty little airhead who'd trip on her own feet going up the stairs, but I'm used to getting her out of scrapes, so I didn't think this would be any different. Savina was too speechless with shock even to be offended. What the hell was Reka playing at? Was she waiting until they were alone because she wanted to kill Savina herself? Was she trying to get Savina to let down her guard so she could betray her? Reka ignored her, smiling calmly at Kachik. Kachik frowned and turned back to Savina. Savina pasted a look of innocent confusion on her face, as if she hadn't quite figured out whether what Reka had said was an insult or a compliment. Inside, though, she felt as knocked off balance as if Reka had hit her over the head. "Well," said Kachik, shrugging, "I can't let her go, of course, but maybe she'll make your temporary captivity more bearable." Behind his back, a muscle in Reka's jaw jerked, but the woman's voice, when she spoke, was as calm as ever. "Yes, I suppose it would give me someone to talk to, at least. Although, as I said, conversation isn't her strong point." Kachik chuckled. "Well, I'll leave you two lovers to work out the details. In the meantime, I'll have my guards take you somewhere safe." He paused. "Reka, if you cooperate, there is no downside to this for you. Either you get your revenge on Kavako, or, failing that, you get back to your home in safety. But I'm very busy trying to arrange things with Matten, and I don't have time or energy to spare on you right now, so I'll do everything in my power to keep you happy, and you, in turn, will do everything in your power to keep me happy. Are we clear?" Reka leaned back against the wall and fixed him with that cool, indifferent gaze that she'd used on Savina so many times. He watched her, smiling slightly. "Well, I have plenty of work to do. I'll have my guards take you to your quarters." He turned to the Yibo woman, who appeared to be captain of the guards, and Savina's wavelength translated his speech as he switched back to the Yibo language. "Keep Reka alive. She's dangerous, but she's an asset I don't want to waste, so her life is worth more than any guards right now. Provoke her at your peril. You won't kill her unless I determine it's necessary." Then he turned on his heel and strode out of the room. Chapter 12. Alba. "And how's your leg feeling this morning?" asked the Yibo woman, who seemed to have adopted Alba. "It's much better, thank you," Alba said, trying to keep the irritation from her voice. She took a deep breath. "And you?" she asked. It was more awkward than she'd expected, asking someone about their private life. "I understand your granddaughter was ill?" The Yibo woman hummed comfortably. "She's much better this morning, but thank you for asking." She waved a hand over her wrist device, and a small, holographic image of a skinny, large-eyed creature that must be a Yibo infant appeared over her wrist. "That's my Pri," she said, smiling a fond, close-lipped Yibo smile. Alba inspected the small creature critically, and the Yibo woman laughed. "Not much for babies, are you?" She said it as though it was the most natural thing in the world. When they're your grandbabies, you can't help but love them, but I'll admit they are funny-looking. Alba stared at her for a moment, then gave an undignified snort of laughter, and the Yibo woman joined in. When she'd recovered herself, Alba glanced back at the tiny, odd creature in the image. It truly was funny-looking, but there was something about the way the Yibo woman had spoken of the child. "I'd like to meet her sometime," said Alba quietly. She wasn't sure who she surprised more by the words, the Yibo woman or herself. "I didn't take you as one who cared for such things," said the woman, her expression softening. "But I'm sure she'd love to see a human, if you don't mind being stared at a little, that is." There was a commotion at the doorway, and Alba glanced up to see one of the younger Yibo burst into the room, chattering so rapidly that Alba's wavelength struggled to translate. Whatever it was, though, it sounded serious. The mayor, who was in attendance that day, said something sharp, and the younger Yibo nodded, tipping their head to one side, then disappeared out the door. "Kachik's people are on their way," the mayor said in Yibo, turning back to the rest of them. "I'll speak with them." She paused, as if not wanting to say the next words. "And I suppose we'd best keep the humans hidden." She said it with a faint air of distaste. If they see we have something like that, they'll ask for more in taxes. Her stood, offering her hand to Alba. Come, she said. What's happening? Asked Josip. Our planet happens to be smack in the middle of the two factions, said her, gesturing the humans to follow her. She pulled back a transparent curtain for them to slip behind. As Alba opened her mouth to protest, she realized the curtain wasn't, in fact, transparent. It was painted in such a way that it looked to show an empty room behind, but in fact it was opaque, enough so that it would be difficult to see anything through it. It's the problem of living here, the woman continued as she settled them in seats. Don't make a sound. You don't want their attention. Kachik's people don't think much of humans. They've gotten high and mighty since they opened the portal. We'll never hear the end of it now. She turned back to Josip. Difficult to live where we do. Growing season is good, but ever since Kachik made Chur his headquarters, we've been caught between him and the government, and both want their due in taxes. Alba began, not certain she'd heard right. Hush, they'll be here in a second. The Yibo woman slipped out, and Alba glanced over at Josip and Feliu. By their expressions, they were just as confused as she was. From the other room, they could hear the chattering voices of the Yibo, then heavier footsteps as, apparently, whoever it was that the mayor had been worried about stepped through the doors. We're here for the taxes, came a bored Yibo voice. Well, thankfully, we're just finishing up, said her tone homey and comfortable. The newcomer snorted. Let me see. There were a few moments' silence, then the sound of rustling cloth. 22 units? He asked at last. It's unfortunate that you work so slowly. Her hummed. It is, but artisan workmanship takes time. The man snorted in irritation. Very well. I'll take these and we'll be back in a month. Of course, said her, and Alba could hear the smile in her voice. You're welcome any time. Well, come show me the units you've set aside, said the man impatiently, and Alba heard footsteps moving off. It was long enough later that Alba's muscles had stiffened when Her came back to fetch them. You can come out, they're gone, she said. Her face was uncharacteristically grave. But, from the sound of it, they weren't just here for the taxes. They're looking for someone else as well. She fixed Alba with a sharp glance. Alba took a deep breath. Every instinct inside her told her to prevaricate, try to find some half-truth to hide behind. But she pictured Josip's easy smile, Her's soft expression as she spoke of her grandchild. I believe I know what they were looking for, Alba said at last in a low voice. I believe they were after us. After me. The Yibo woman was silent, watching her. Under her placid expression, her gaze was surprisingly, uncomfortably perceptive. Alba sighed. Perhaps we should have told you. Joska, at least, advocated for that. But we were desperate. We were not sure those of us who were injured would survive if you chose not to shelter us, and after some conversation, we concluded anyone after us would likely not pose a threat to you. And you were the ones who could make that decision for us? The woman asked. Alba couldn't read her tone. Josip and Feliu were watching, Josip looking concerned, Feliu offended, but neither seemed inclined to interrupt. Alba almost wished, irrationally, that Josip would. This was his forte, not hers. Perhaps I was wrong, she said at last. I don't know. But these people were depending on me to keep them safe, and I couldn't bear To her horror, she found her voice choking. There was a long moment of silence. At last the woman sighed and pulled up a seat of her own. Well, maybe we should all have a talk then. Alba closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. There, we're more than just us that made it through the portal, she said finally, and you are not the first Yibo we encountered. Her nodded, watching her with an unreadable expression. You ran into Kachik's people, then? Yes, and some of the other humans who arrived with us were more willing to negotiate with him than we were. Or rather, she added wryly. We're more willing to give him what he wanted. Consequences to our own system be hanged. The Yibo woman was still watching her. And for us, here, stuck between the government and Kachik, you truly didn't think taking you in would affect us? Alba paused, frowning. Stuck between the government and Kachik? I thought Kachik was the head of government. An amused smile appeared on hers face for a moment. Oh, he'd like you to think that. They've been a thorn in the government side for over a decade now. A bunch of nativists. The government never took too much notice until they used the old mechanism here to open the portal. She shook her head. There's some of us think humans deserve more than what they got last time we found one of their colonies. She glanced at Alba sideways. I'm sorry. I don't mean to open up bad memories. Alba began. Her mind was blank with shock. Kachik wasn't part of the government, but a splinter group, a nativist group. So many nagging questions falling into place. And then this, the last time the Yibo found a human colony. Alba cleared her throat. I apologize. I wasn't fully aware of the politics here, and I was never told what happened to the Labyrinto colony. We'd been trying to contact them without success for some time now. Her turned to her, her eyes surprisingly compassionate. I'm sorry, she sighed. I should tell the mayor all of this by rights, but if I do, you're probably right, you'll be thrown out. We can't afford to get on Kachik's bad side, not living so close. If they don't know we're here, Phalia began. Her shook her head. That won't last forever. But I don't see how we can just throw you out. I'll talk to her about keeping you somewhere safe at all times, so you're not seen. That means while you're here, I'll be keeping an eye on you, and when you're not, you're back in the hospital. In fact, I think I'll try to get the rest of your group moved to beds in there as well. And then what? Asked Josip softly. Her shook her head again. I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, what happened with the last human colony was wrong. After the massacre, there were those in the government who believed our contact with humans should be made along other lines. But, she shrugged, Kachik's party has always believed differently. Said the raiders have the right of it, seeing humans as livestock. Said we should go in and take what we want, and not let them contaminate our society any further. They're trying to remove every hint of human culture from the Yibo, though with how far back it goes, I doubt that's even possible. These precautions are for your benefit as much as for ours. If Kachik's people find you, they'll almost certainly kill you. Better for everyone if you stay out of sight and leave as soon as you're able. We were not planning on staying forever, said Alba softly, but there is information we need before we can leave. Information about the portal and about what happened to the Labyrinto colony. Studied her. Well, she said finally, it's getting late, but you asked to see my grandchild earlier, didn't you? Perhaps you and your friends can come by my house after work tomorrow and we can talk? Alba nodded. She wasn't sure she could have spoken if she'd wanted to. Chapter 13. Aran. After a quick breakfast, Aran sighed, glancing up at the slope stretching ahead of them. Well, said Istvay, shall we? Aran nodded grimly. He tried not to think about how weak and pale Istvay looked in the early morning sunlight as they started off. I don't like this, said Istvay as the two of them scrambled up the steep slope, but let's at least get somewhere high enough that we can catch our bearings, and maybe we can figure a way out of this. Aran nodded. How long do you think they'll follow us? Istvay gave a wry chuckle. That's the question, isn't it? They sighed. I have no idea, but considering they've followed us halfway across the system so far, I'm not really very hopeful of them giving up. They paused. Do you have any idea what the hell they were talking about? Somebody killing one of their people? Aran shook his head. I wish I did, he muttered. I'd like to see the person who could kill one of those things and walk away from it. The forest around them was silent, and Aran tried not to think too hard about why that might be. Maybe it was just a superstition. Maybe that was the reason the raiders hadn't followed him and Istvay up the mountain. Or maybe there was some religious significance attached to the place. Or maybe they had indeed come around the back and were waiting for Aran and Istvay, watching as they struggled their way up the mountain, unwitting, into a trap. The snap of a twig under his foot jerked his attention back, and that was the only thing, probably, that saved his life. He managed a choked curse. Then Istvay had grabbed him, dragging him back from the edge of the pit as it opened up under his feet. He didn't move quite fast enough, and for a moment he was dangling in midair. Then Istvay yanked him up, and his feet caught the ground under him, and he was standing, gasping, on the edge of a pit, covered with twigs and leaves to look like the surrounding forest floor. Aran and Istvay stared at each other for a moment, then down at the pit. The bottom of it was lined with thick metal stakes, sharpened and pointing straight up, ready to catch and disembowel the unwary creature who stumbled on it, and there was a thin blue laser tripwire across the path in front of them. "What the hell?" Aran began, but Istvay gave a sharp shake of their head. "Please, Aran, I'm trying really damn hard not to think about what might have happened. Let's just thank the damn mystery that you're alive and watch our step." Aran nodded, swallowing hard. He wasn't about to argue with Istvay's logic. He and Istvay hadn't gone more than another half-kilometer when they sprang another trap. This time it was Ani's hissing that warned them, and they both leapt back as a massive boulder crashed through the trees centimeters away from where they stood. It tumbled past, leaving mangled, flattened undergrowth in its wake, and Aran stared after it, shaken. When the third trap sprang, and Ani, with an insulted yowl, was yanked into a net, which she promptly melted with her acid, Aran and Istvay eyed each other. Maybe that's why the raiders didn't want to follow, said Istvay as Ani, hissing, proceeded to destroy the last remnants of the net that had so thoroughly insulted her. Maybe it's a hunting ground, and they didn't want to risk being caught. Maybe, Aran said, looking around uneasily. But traps like these would require someone to be checking them. Otherwise, we'd see dead animals lying around. So either they're very inefficient or... Please, said Istvay, their voice grim. Like I said, unless there's something we can damn well do about it, I really don't want to think about this. Aran shrugged, and they moved forward. I think we're getting close to the top, Aran panted as the sun reached its midday zenith. They were moving slowly. Between the steepness of the grade and Istvay's obvious weakness, they hadn't made it nearly as far as they should have. But then again, if it was true the raiders were waiting for them on the other side of the mountain, they might be merely delaying their own demise. He glanced surreptitiously at Istvay, worry twisting in his stomach. I'm fine, Istvay snapped. I'm not about to keel over, if that's your question. Aran sighed. Istvay had never been the most even-tempered when they weren't feeling well. It's fine, Pishti. Don't worry about it. We'll just... Look, as long as the raiders aren't actively chasing us, we're not in any hurry. This planet is supposed to be populated. We'll just keep going until we find a friendly settlement. They were in a hurry. They had maybe enough food to last 2 more days. They'd already begun rationing, but he couldn't ration much more, not with Istvay as weak as they were, and neither of them could afford Istvay simply collapsing on the trail. As much as he wanted to, as much as he would if he had to, if Aran tried to carry Istvay the entire way, there was no way he'd be able to outrun anything following them. And he wasn't nearly naive enough to assume that the raiders, who had followed them across half the galaxy, would have a change of heart and decide that, after all, it wasn't worth waiting for them to come back down the mountain. Let's go a bit farther. Then we'll take a break, he said instead. He'd have preferred to suggest a rest right away, but judging from the stubborn expression on Istvay's face, they would see through his ploy and utterly refuse. It looks like it might flatten out a little up ahead, said Istvay, peering up the mountains, and Aran nodded. The two of them started forward again, Aran staying close to Istvay's side, both to increase the chance that one of them would see any traps at their feet, and also to be in place to grab Istvay should they collapse. At last, the two of them broke through a stretch of trees and into a patch of open ground. Aran turned, offering his hand to help Istvay up the last scramble, and then, at Ani's startled growl from his shoulder, turned around again, taking an unconscious step forward to catch his balance, and ran full-on into something warm and solid. What? He began. Whatever it was he'd run into made a similar exclamation of surprise. Then he heard Istve's startled yelp and Ani's furious hiss, and his mind caught up with the rest of his body. He leapt back, grabbing for Ani instinctively, as she jumped forward to either melt, liquefy, or poison the newcomer, and yanked out his pulse pistol with the hand that wasn't holding Ani, leveling it at the raider woman in front of him. She stood where she was, blinking at them in shock. She looked similar to the raiders who were chasing them, her skin deathly pale, her eyes red, fangs changing her disturbingly human face into something from a horror tale. But her black hair was cut into a short bob, and her outfit a practical blue shirt and trousers rather than the gray and black armored suits of their pursuers. She said something in a guttural, rich tone, words that didn't sound at all familiar, but made something click in the back of Iran's brain. She sighed at his look of utter incomprehension, and tried again, in common dialect this time. You are humans?" Iran was still holding his pulse pistol with one hand and clutching on to an irate Ani with the other. He said, Yes, we're humans." The smile she turned on them was utterly delighted, despite the large fangs visible through the expression. "Wonderful! I'd been so hoping to meet one of you." Ani was still hissing angrily, struggling to get free of Iran's grasp. Iran and Istve simply stared. "Oh, don't worry," the raider said breezily, waving a casual hand. "I'm not going to eat you. I've been wanting live specimens to study for quite some time now. Come, come." They were still staring as she turned, beckoning them to follow. She seemed to realize, after she'd got a few steps, that they hadn't, in fact, followed. "What's the matter?" She was looking at them as if they were an interesting scientific problem. "You're still afraid that I am going to eat you?" She laughed. "You're so funny. If I wanted to eat you, I'd just kill you now. It would be much easier than waiting for you to climb the rest of the way up to my research station." Your research station?" Aron managed, his brain grasping desperate hold onto any words that seemed to make sense. "Yes," she said impatiently. "I assume that you have scientists on your planet? It's a place we go to study things in their natural habitat." I know what a research station is," said Aron stupidly. His brain seemed to be having trouble firing on all synapses. "Well, good then. Let's go," she said. "Your friend there looks like he's not going to last much longer on his feet anyway." Aron glanced reflexively at Istve, who was swaying a little. They shot him their signature glare. "I'm fine," they muttered. They were very clearly not fine. They turned to the raider, who was watching them curiously. "Aron's friend here is entirely capable of speaking for themselves," they said. "But yes, you're right. We could both use a rest. So..." They glanced at Aron and gave a helpless shrug. "I suppose lead the way?" It wasn't far to the research station or wherever the hell the raider was taking them, but it seemed to take an absurdly long time to get there. Istve was stumbling, and after his recent panicked flight and the 3 days of travel previous, combined with the leftover panic of running into the raider woman, Aron's legs had turned to something akin to jelly. But at last, the group of them stepped through the tree line and out into a small mountain clearing, neat and clean, with an oddly shaped shelter erected in the center. It was circular, with a peaked roof and walls made of a thick material that at first glance Aron took to be synthetic, but on closer look made him wonder if it was some sort of animal hide. He almost asked out of curiosity, then caught sight of the grim look on Istve's face and sighed. Istve was right. There were more pressing concerns than the construction material of their captor's shelter. Come in," the raider said cheerfully, sliding the door open along a sort of track. Ani was growling uneasily on Aron's shoulder, but she seemed to have decided that, at least at present, their host was not posing an active threat to their lives, and had decided to extend to her the same courtesy. Istve hesitated a moment in the doorway, then stepped inside. Aron followed. Then he almost forgot the imminent mortal peril they were in his surprise. The room was set up like a field science lab, similar to what he and Istve would put together at their base camp. There were measuring devices hung neatly on the walls, and beakers of sample material, neatly labeled, set on the table. And at the sight of the labels, the niggling familiarity of the raider's speech clicked into place in Iran's mind, and he almost gasped. It was the same language as the samples they'd been sent through the portal, however many lifetimes ago that seemed. He hadn't recognized it the first time he'd heard it, in the strain of the raiders screaming at each other for his and Istvay's death. To be honest, he'd been a bit distracted at the time, but now, with no immediate threat to his life. He took a deep breath, trying to push back the sudden giddiness. They'd been right. Ree, back in the Yibo city, had been right. Somehow, these raiders had sent that box through the portal. Which meant that somewhere out here, on this planet or another, was the answer. The path to a cure for Istvay's death sentence. "Sit," the raider was saying, and he blinked out of his daze to find Istvay watching him in concern. "Aran," they began quietly. He shook his head. It's nothing. I'm fine," he muttered. "Go on, sit down," the raider said again, pushing 2 cushions across the floor towards them. Aran sat automatically, and Istvay fell more than sat, unable to stifle a groan of relief. The raider woman had her back to them, going through her supplies, and a moment later she came over with the platter of, well, Aran wasn't entirely sure what they were, but they were apparently supposed to be for him and Istvay to eat. "I've been studying humans for some time, but I've never had any here in person," she said, thrusting the tray out towards them. "I'd love to see how you react to this food. I have a theory that—" said Aran quickly. We just ate." The raider looked faintly disappointed. "Maybe next time then," she said philosophically. "You humans get hungry fairly frequently, if I understand correctly." Aran took a deep breath. "Listen," he said, we've been—" Now that he was here, he found it was almost impossible to get the words to come out. Listen, there was a portal that opened up, and one of you sent something through it. A raider did, I mean." He didn't dare to look at her. He couldn't bear another disappointment. The chance of finding someone who had any idea about what he was looking for. "Oh!" Her tone was so delighted that Aran blinked and looked up at her in surprise. "You got my box? I wasn't sure when I sent it through that it ended at the right planet, but I was pretty confident. Like I said, I've been studying you for some time now, and I had so hoped that you would respond. But I had no idea you'd actually send someone through yourselves, especially before Captain Sharda shut down the portal." She was smiling, an expression that, even with her red eyes and sharp incisors, was intimately familiar to Aran, the smile of someone whose scientific theory has just been validated. He, however, felt a little like he'd been hit in the head by a brick. "You—" His voice was choking, and he almost couldn't get out the words. "You were the one who sent the box?" "Of course." She glanced over at him. "You don't think anyone else would have, do you? Most raiders see you as a food source, which, in fairness, you are delicious. But that's no excuse not to further our knowledge in this area." She shook her head. "I've been researching this for years now. There's undeniably human DNA in most of our bloodlines, if you go far enough back, which means our 2 species are clearly sexually compatible, and if we're genetically close enough for sexual reproduction that can produce fertile offspring, it seems not only logical but vital that we make a thorough and careful study of your culture, as it almost certainly ties into ours." She spoke with the tone of someone who was intimately familiar with her area of study and who seldom was able to find a captive audience to hear her theories out. Istvay volunteered, sounding almost as shell-shocked as Aran was. Excuse me for interrupting, but you shut down the portal?" She glanced at Istvay and laughed. "I didn't. I told you that was Captain Sharda. She wanted to make sure that we had time to communicate with the other raider ships. I understand your species is quite gregarious, but we raiders tend to exist in semi-isolated societies, which makes communication difficult at times. Last time the Yibo opened a portal to a human system, they went through and took what they wanted, and we had to make do with the leftovers." But this time, Sharda thought if she could shut down the portal and give herself time to send word to the others, by the time the Yibo opened the portal again, we'd be prepared to go through and harvest what we needed first. The Yibo are frightened enough of us that they're not going to stand in our way, so when you say harvest, Istvay sounded faintly sick. The scientist glanced over at them. I'm sorry, that was probably insensitive. I wasn't thinking. I don't like it myself, I'll be honest with you. But I've tried to talk to Captain Krivai, and he's impossible to convince. I say that you're a sapient species, and that you deserve to live as much as any of us, but he insists that it's part of the natural order of things, and everyone needs to eat, and so it hardly seems that morality needs to come into it. Aran glanced over at his friend. They were staring at the raider woman, an expression of mingled surprise and horror on their face, which, in fairness, Aran understood. He was certain that once his brain had the opportunity to process the fact that, had the portal remained open any longer, these raiders would have come streaming through, intent on slaughtering their way across the Joias System. He would be just as horrified as Istvay was. But right now he had something much more important to worry about. You sent the box, he said again. He could hardly recognize his own voice. Yes, she said. And you say that your people interbred with humans somewhere back along the lines? She nodded. It's not a popular theory, but I've done enough studies to be very confident in my findings. Aran nodded again. Can you tell me who gave the blood sample that you sent? She stared at him for a moment, a rapid flurry of emotions tracing over her face. I can tell you who gave the sample, she said, a note of hesitation in her voice. As a matter of fact, she glanced out the window to the research station uneasily. Listen, it might be best if you... Ani, on Aran's shoulder, perked up, her eye pouches puffing out as she growled. It was only then that Aran realized that the sound he'd been hearing in the back of his mind, and paying no attention to because he was much too concerned about what this raider woman was telling him, had been footsteps. And then the door to the small shelter burst open, and someone ducked inside. The newcomer was another raider, taller by a full head than the scientist. He was wearing full body armor, although it was a dark, glossy, bluish purple, rather than the gray and black of their former pursuers, and carrying a weapon that made the Yibo's atom guns look like child's toys. A flowing, scarlet cape draped off his shoulders, and his hair fell almost to the floor. He smiled, light glinting off his sharp incisors, and his blood-red eyes as he surveyed the tiny group. The scientist jumped to her feet. Captain Krivai, she said, a trace of nervousness in her voice. I see you've come earlier than you planned. The raider captain laughed, a low, chilling sound. Aran could see through the open door behind the captain an entire crew of raiders, all in the same bluish-purple uniforms, filling the small clearing where the research station had been built. You don't look happy to see me, Desi, said the captain in a rich voice that vibrated through the cabin. You should be. I'm very pleased with you. I'm hungry after this last week's work, and it looks like you've provided a feast. Chapter 14. Alba. Alba slept poorly that night. By the end of the workday the next day, her muscles were so tight her entire body ached. But at last, the endless day ended, and Alba and the others were gathered at Her's home. Like most Yibo buildings, the small space was bright and airy, the warm evening sun streaming in through the translucent walls and plants, and greenery spilling from every available surface. The seats in the house were set up similar to the ones Alba had seen in the Yibo city, rising in tiers up the wall. Her looked around quickly. Oh, I apologize. I'd forgotten. I don't have the kind of stools you humans like. Alba could scarcely refrain from a small sigh of relief. Her posterior ached at even the thought of those damnable hard stools. I think we'll manage, she said dryly. Josip gave her an amused glance. Well, if you're sure, said her voice uncertain. Your thoughtfulness is appreciated, said Josip, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. But really, please don't distress yourself. It's your company we came for, not your furniture. The Yibo woman hummed in amusement and nodded, gesturing to the tiers of seats. They weren't uncomfortable, despite their odd appearance, and as Alba sank down into one of the lower seats, she breathed a small sigh of relief at getting the weight off her broken knee. Her brought out a plate of food. Nicolau and the others of the crew, who'd been working at harvesting all day, dug in with a will, and Alba ate to be polite. She could hardly taste it. At last, Her put down the platter and took a seat. "I suppose you have questions," she said. The Labyrinto colony." Alba took a deep breath. "Is it really destroyed?" The Yibo woman sighed. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. It happened about—" She frowned, as if making some calculation in her head. "Perhaps 3 decades ago, in our years. I'm not sure what that would be in your time, but at any rate, it was around the time my daughter was born." She shook her head. "They told us, back then, that we were looking for humans because we were worried. Some time ago, 20 generations back, or more probably, our ancestors encountered humans. We don't have many records from that time, but at some stage humans and our ancestors intermingled, to the point that you'd be hard-pressed to find a Yibo today without human blood, however small the amount." She paused, her gaze distant. Alba glanced at Josip. "It must have been one of the missing generation ships that ran across this system," she said quietly, and he nodded. They were in touch with a few of their sister colonies, back in the Joias System, but there were ships they'd never heard from in living memory. Alba turned back to the Yibo woman. "Do you have any idea who the humans were? Where they came from?" The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, it was so long ago, and whatever happened, there was an event that destroyed most of the records. We don't know, really, much of what our society was like back then, or what happened. Maybe there was a disease that decimated the population, maybe it was a war. As I said, we have very few records, but over the last 100 years, more and more people have been getting curious about our history because, despite the societal crash that happened around the time when the Yibo met the humans, there was a technological jump of a magnitude we haven't seen since. Most of our technologies can trace their roots back to that era. And we thought, for some time, that humans had been wiped out, that was the only group of humans in existence. But as more and more people became interested in our history and began going back through what records we had, they found indications perhaps it was not. That perhaps there were still humans out there. And that, of course, led to a debate. Was it worth trying to find humans? And if so, what should our relationship with them be? We had the technology to open portals by that point, and we were using it regularly for exploration and travel to more distant systems. So, if we were to find another human colony, it was well within the realm of possibility that we could initiate contact. She shook her head. "I don't think anyone really intended for there to be a massacre, but—" She shrugged. "We had word of them. We opened a portal, and those in power in the government at the time were either aggressive or afraid or both. They demanded the humans prove their peaceful intent by surrendering, and humans didn't. And—" She trailed off. "You've seen the difference between our weaponry and yours. As I said, we had a technological leap when our two cultures met, but it didn't mean that what the people in the Labyrinto system, as you call it, had created wasn't valuable. And our system was split. There were those who were horrified at what had happened to the humans and wished to protect any other colony of humans to enter into a friendly, two-sided relationship, rather than a one-sided massacre, and those who believed that our society was advanced to the point that humans were the equivalent of animals, and that they should be utilized for their technology and then destroyed. I'm certain you have guessed, by now, which side Kachik's party was on," she added dryly. Alba's mind was spinning, and her brain balked at the implications of what she was hearing. An entire human civilization, the equivalent of the entire Joias system, not just the planet of Colorida, but the entire system, gone. The sheer destruction that would entail, the number of lives lost. She wasn't sure she could comprehend it. She wasn't sure she wanted to. "And that's why these rebels opened the portal?" asked Josip at last. There was a sick tone to his voice that told her the news had affected him as much as it had her. Her nodded. Wasn't quite that simple, I don't think, but it's part of the reason. There's been unrest in the government for a while. Kachik's party was formed supposedly to protect the purity of the Yibo culture. They don't want anything to do with anything human. They were a legitimate political party for a while, but as they became more radical, they slowly lost their moderate followers. Until now, they're mostly a party of fanatics. When your system was discovered, there was a fight over whether to leave it alone or whether to open a portal in the hope of another leap in technology. In the end, Kachik didn't have enough political support to convince the government of his views, so he and his supporters relocated to Charar and declared themselves an independent government. Everyone was shocked when they managed to open a portal, except for those of us on this planet because we've been watching them work on their mechanism for the last decade. But we're just a little rural planet, so no one in the government pays us much attention. I think Kachik wanted to get to your technology first, and then use it to open a rebellion against the government proper. But who knows? There were a few long moments of silence. Did any of the humans in the Labyrinto system survive? Alba asked at last, quietly. There are still some survivors, said Her. That's why we weren't all that surprised to see humans here. It's difficult to wipe out an entire civilization, even if the raiders did their best. There are humans throughout the system, and probably some back in their own system as well. But, she shrugged, if what I hear is correct, if there are any back in their system, they're living on bombed-out planets. Not somewhere easy to survive. For a while they sipped their drinks, not speaking. Alba didn't dare look at the faces of the others. She already knew what she'd see, but she caught a glimpse of Nicolao's stunned expression, the pallor in his face, and the way Ines was squeezing his hand like she couldn't let go if she wanted to. There was a small, high-pitched squeal, and Alba turned quickly to see a tiny Yibo child with wide eyes and dark fur come running in, followed a moment later by another Yibo woman, slightly younger than their host. Her got to her feet and crossed the floor, picking up the child in one arm as it squealed and chattered. She tugged its ears affectionately, then put it down and turned to talk to the adult. The child approached the group of humans cautiously, glancing at them out of the corners of its eyes, taking small, sidling steps as if ready to run at the first hint of a threat. Josip smiled and held out a hand. "Hello there," he said, his tone warm and friendly. "What's your name?" The child watched him with large, wary eyes, but at last came closer. The Yibo women had turned and were watching with indulgent expressions as the child reached out tentatively and touched Josip's hand, then skittered backwards. "That's my granddaughter," said Her. There was no mistaking the pride in her voice. "Her name is Pri." Josip smiled and held out his hand again. "Hello there, Pri," he said. This time the child came close enough to take Josip's outstretched hand, examining it curiously. Then she turned to Feliu, and he gave an undignified squeak of surprise as the child took his hand as well, yanking it over to compare it with Josip's. Josip smiled, and Feliu sputtered, and Her called something to the child, who pouted, but let go of the two men's hands. Alba almost smiled herself at the look on her old clerk's face. And then the child turned to Alba, reaching up to touch the wrinkles on her face. She jerked back, startled. The child scampered a few steps off, eyes wide with fright. Alba took a deep breath. "Hello, Pri," she said, somewhat stiffly. "I apologize for startling you." Pri took a cautious step forward, then another, until she was at Alba's knees, her wide, dark eyes staring up into Alba's. Alba forced herself not to react as the child reached up again, running her small hands over Alba's face. She'd never particularly liked children, but there was something about the soft, hesitant fingers brushing her skin that sparked something warm in her chest, like when she herself was a child and a butterfly had settled on her hand, resting there for a moment before fluttering off. Something small and wild that, for whatever unknowable reason, trusted her enough to let down its guard, just for a moment. When she looked up, Her was watching her, a soft expression on her face. When the Yibo woman came to sit down again, the child scampered over and climbed up on her lap. The woman seemed not to mind being poked and prodded by childish fingers as she spoke. Your granddaughter is lovely, said Alba, and she was surprised at the sincerity in her tone. Her's eyes glinted with pride. She's very intelligent for her age. She glanced down indulgently as the child slid off her lap to scamper across the room after some distraction or another. And you? Do you have grandchildren? Alba cleared her throat. I do not. But I think Josip... She caught the way Josip's face changed, the brief flash of pain in his eyes, and she felt a quick pang of guilt. She should have paid more attention. I had a grandson, he said after a moment, but he died a few years ago. He paused a moment, clearing his throat. He would have been 13 years old this year. I'm sorry, said the Yibo woman, and for a moment they sat in silence. At last, though, her shook her head. She is a little troublemaker sometimes. Still, it's been harder and harder to keep anyone out of trouble since Kachik's people opened that portal machinery on our planet. There was a wry note to her voice, and Alba exchanged glances with Josip. The portal mechanism is here on your planet? Said Alba, her heart rate speeding up. She tried to keep her voice neutral. I'm sure that must make things difficult. The woman made a small gesture with her hand, but there was something sharp in her expression that told Alba the topic hadn't come up by chance. The government doesn't have the political will to start a full-on war with Kachik's people yet, which, thank the gods, means we're not in a war zone. But powers above protect us all when that happens. I'd be interested in seeing this portal mechanism, said Alba at last, carefully. I imagine you would be, said her. She paused. I will tell you, though, as a friend, stay away from it. Kachik's people are guarding it. It would be next to impossible to get close. Believe me, there are those of us who'd love nothing more than to see the thing destroyed, but they watch it closely. And where is it exactly? Alba asked. The woman studied Alba for a moment. At last, she stood and walked over to her table. She picked up a small metal sphere and tapped the base of it, and a holographic map appeared, spreading around her hand like a halo. Alba's pulse was racing, a sick feeling of something between anticipation and dread tightening her throat. Carefully, she blinked twice, activating the scan and record on her wavelength. This is our village, Her said, tapping a point on the map. She rotated it a half turn, and the mechanism is here. She tapped the map off and returned to her seat. But please be careful. There are far too many guards, and even if, you'll excuse my impoliteness, even if you were all young and strong like these ones. She gestured to Benny, Nicolau, and Inez. You'd be shot down for certain. It's a bunker, for all intents and purposes. And after the raiders attacked the last time and took down the defenses, they've doubled or tripled the guard. You may as well give up the thought. The rest of the evening's conversation was stilted. Alba's mind was far too caught up in the enormity of what she'd learned for her to pay much heed to the small talk, but Her seemed to understand and didn't press her. It was dark by the time they left Her's house. The Yibo woman escorted them down the narrow streets to the hospital in the light of the hovering artificial lamps. But Alba noticed, as Her left them at the hospital door, a handful of guards who hadn't been there the evening before standing at the entrance. On the one hand, it made it less likely Alba or any of the others would be murdered in their sleep. On the other, they wouldn't be leaving here without the Yibo's consent, unless they made some mad escape. And for what? To try to sneak into a heavily guarded bunker and take it down like in an audio romance? She glanced at her companions and almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. A handful of geriatric bureaucrats, a world-weary cargo ship captain and her ex-military crew who was clearly past his prime, a timid interpreter from the Rim Mountains, and the two younger siblings of the Joias System's most notorious assassin, trying to take on armed Yibo soldiers who could take down the raiders. For just a moment, she pictured the creatures who'd intercepted them on their way out of the Yibo city with their blood-red eyes and sharp fangs. No, it was impossible. Even with Joska and Nicolau and Inez, it was impossible. When they reached their rooms, Alba sank down on her cot. Well, she said at last, glancing around at the others, at the very least, we've discovered what happened to the Labyrinto system. Joska studied her for a long moment, her expression grave. I'm sorry, Chief Justice, she said at last. I know this wasn't what any of us hoped for. Unwanted tears were welling in Alba's eyes, and she forced them back. This was not the time for self-pity. At least we know where the portal mechanism is, she said finally, and it appears we still have time to make plans. Although what those plans may be... She trailed off. Then she frowned. Where's Josip? He's in the hallway still, said Feilu. Someone was calling him on the wavelength from back in the Yibo city. Something uneasy stirred in Alba's stomach. Josip's friends back in the Yibo city shouldn't have any reason to contact him. I'll go speak with him, she said sharply. The rest of you, please stay here. She forced herself to her feet, despite the jolt of pain through her broken knee, and limped out into the hallway. Josip stood there, leaned up against the wall. He didn't seem to notice her come out, just stared straight ahead, his face blank. She realized, with an uncomfortable jolt, that the news of the Labyrinto system's destruction must have hit him as hard as it had hit her, and she hadn't thought to offer him even a portion of the comfort in return that he'd offered her. Josip, she said quietly. He turned. What's wrong? Her voice was sharper than she meant it to be, but she was so accustomed to his smile that his exhausted expression was jarring. His smile in response was wan. I'm afraid I have bad news. Captain Matten has apparently withdrawn his requirement for proof of your death, prior to opening the portal. Now it's just a matter of them finalizing their agreements. They'll be opening it any day now. For a few moments, she simply stared at him. He shook his head, still with that wan smile. I'm sorry, I suppose we should go tell the others. Alba nodded, and then, slowly, she looked up, meeting his gaze. You're right, we need to tell the others. But I think perhaps we have more going for us than you're considering. If you recall, we're not the only ones who escaped Kashyyyk, and, you remember, one of our fellow escapees has a weapon of mass destruction for a pet. And, if the news packets are to be believed, a lifetime of experience of sneaking into places while things are trying to kill him. Josip met her eyes, his wan smile growing a little more genuine. You know, I'd forgotten that. Alba smiled back, surprised at the relief seeing the familiar twinkle in Josip's eye brought. I think, Josip, there's just a chance this may not be the end yet. Chapter 15. Savina. When Kashyyyk was gone, the guards pulled Savina and Reka roughly to their feet and marched them down the corridors of whatever building they'd been taken to. They ended in a small room lit by an artificial light, with a cot in one corner and something that could have been the Yibo equivalent of a table in the center, along with two of the ubiquitous stools. We'll be bringing you your meals regularly, said the captain of the guards who brought them there. She spoke in accented common dialect, biting off her words, and there was a look on her face that told Savina that, while Kashyyyk may have been impressed by Reka's ability to kill guards, this particular captain had a very different view of the matter. If you make trouble, I can't guarantee your safety. Reka looked at her with that indifferent gaze and gave a small nod. Good, said the captain. If you need something, there's an alert button on the door that you can use. You'll be taken out for air and exercise once in the morning and once at night. You will be guarded at all times. I would advise you not to try anything. There was a tone in her voice that told Savina she very much hoped Reka would try something. Reka just gave her another cool, emotionless nod and turned away. When the guard had left, there was a long, long moment of silence. At last, Savina turned to Reka. What the hell? She began, her voice shaking a little. Reka deliberately turned her back, and abruptly, the sick combination of fear and guilt and suspicion and the fact that she was stuck here in a cell with Reka, of all the damn people in the universe, condensed into a white-hot anger. She'd be damned if Reka would get away with pulling a stunt like that, then ignoring her. She yanked out one of her hidden knives, her hand trembling. Reka, she purred, is that how you treat your girlfriend? Reka's posture tensed. Savina took a step closer. Reka! Darling! Reka spun. She was clearly furious, but there was something under the anger, a desperate helplessness that Savina had never imagined in Reka. How dare you! Reka hissed, How dare you? Isn't it enough that you've ruined every last damn thing in my life? Isn't it enough that I fell for your damn stupid act again? Your poor, helpless, pitiful me? Even though you tried to kill me? Isn't it enough that I saved your damn life? I'm locked up in here because of you, and I'm sure under that shocked expression on your pretty little face, you're laughing at me. Believe me, I don't care. I have nothing left to lose. But how dare you imply that I owe you anything? Savina gaped, her hand loosening on her knife hilt, her mouth hanging half open. What the hell are you talking about? She snapped at last, but her voice came out more shaky than angry. If you'd gone after Matten, you'd have been shot. He's expecting you. Didn't you hear that? There's no way you would have gotten out of that alive, even if you did manage to kill him. Reka's face twisted, her voice going cold. And that would be worse than this how? I don't want to be here. All I wanted was to stop this, kill Matten. I never expected to get out of it alive. But I have no intention of wasting any more breath on you. If you touch me, I'll kill you. But quite frankly, you're hardly worth the effort. She dropped onto the cot, deliberately turning her back again. But there was a tension to her posture that told Savina that if she tried anything, one of them wouldn't live through it. For a few moments, Savina simply stared. At last, she dropped down into the corner and tipped her head back against the hard wall of the cell. Had Reka been telling the truth? She'd saved Savina because she'd felt sorry for her? She had to be lying. Reka was a killer. She had a reputation as a government agent. No mercy, no quarter, no failures. She had to have had another motive. But an uncomfortable recollection surfaced in Savina's brain. The confused look on Reka's face when Savina had her pinned up against the wall, a knife at her throat, and accused her of trying to kill Nicolau. If I'd wanted to kill your brother, you little idiot, he'd be dead. And Savina had heard the truth in the words. Nicolau had been in Reka's gun sights, and all it would have taken was a twitch of her finger on the trigger. Anyone would have agreed he'd be an acceptable casualty. Savina cursed under her breath. Morals like that were what got people killed, and they deserved what they got, as far as she was concerned. Reka deserved what she was going to get whenever they got out of this. The cell was uncomfortably cool, and Savina wrapped her arms around herself, trying not to shiver. Reka still had her back turned, steadfastly ignoring her, and outside she could hear the footsteps of the Yibo guards, steady and measured. And suddenly she was hit with a memory strong enough she almost gasped. Joska's voice, warm and amused, telling Savina that she was being absurd, and she was a bad one through and through. But Joska knew what it was like to be young and stupid, and as much as she wanted to, she couldn't entirely blame Savina. The feeling of that calloused hand on her shoulder, surprisingly gentle, the concern in the woman's eyes, her dry, faintly indulgent smile when Savina did something ridiculous, the quiet, calm reassurance of her presence. Savina squeezed her eyes closed, trying not to let tears spill out from between her eyelids. With the memory of Joska had come the memory of Raphael, his scowling face and irritated grumbling, Nicolau's eager, boyish grin, the way he'd looked at Savina, half like he was terrified of her, half like he was desperate for her approval. Benny's quiet, unassuming, comfortable presence. It wasn't fair. It wasn't bloody fair. She didn't need them. She didn't need any of them. The tears, though, wouldn't be pushed back, and one trickled down her cheek. She blinked it away angrily. She didn't need a stupid ship's captain and her idiot crew, and Benny and Nicolau were babies. They needed her, not the other way around. She was the one who did the protecting, not the one that needed protection, and... She choked back a small sob. From the corner of her eye, she saw Reka stir, but the woman didn't deign to look in her direction. Savina took a deep breath and scrubbed savagely at her eyes. This was stupid. Joska and Raphael were probably thrilled she was finally gone. As Joska was so fond of reminding her the only thing she was to the woman was a kidnapper and a ship hijacker. She leaned her head against the wall, huddled into a ball for warmth, the after effects of the stun weapon still jittering through her body. Savina. She jerked her head up, looking around quickly, half convinced she'd drifted off, and the voice she'd heard had been a dream. Savina? Savina, if you can hear me, I need you to find a way to answer. Joska's voice through the wavelength was thick with concern. Savina stared blankly for another moment, then blinked twice to activate her wavelength speaker. Joska? She asked. She was rewarded with a dry chuckle. So you are alive after all. We were wondering. There was a pause. You didn't kill whoever it was that took you out there? It's not your damn business, she snapped reflexively. But no, I didn't, she added in a grudging tone. She could picture the smile of approval on Joska's face, and she gritted her teeth against it. I'm proud of you, Savina. Under the touch of irony in her voice, Savina could hear a real warmth. I assume you're in the Yibo city? Sure, I think they call it. Yes, Savina whispered through her link. I'm here, but I got caught. I'm locked up. Caught? By who? Are you all right? Joska's voice was sharp with sudden concern. Kachik. And yes, for the moment, said Savina bitterly. Good. There was unmistakable relief in Joska's voice. When we found you were gone, we decided to come after you, in case you needed help, but it seems we're needed here at the moment. I promised Nicolau and Benny that the moment we can safely get away, we'll come find you. So just hold on, okay? We'll come for you as soon as we can. Savina's throat tightened, so she wasn't sure she could get the words out. She managed. I don't need... She was trying to make her voice harsh, but she wasn't fooling anyone, not even herself. Joska chuckled. I have tried to tell you this before, Savina, but it's never a bad thing to have friends, or, if you're not ready for that, at least allies. Savina nodded mutely, even though she knew Joska couldn't see. She took a deep breath. What's happening there? Is everyone all right? There was a long pause from the other side of the line. Savina narrowed her eyes. You said you were needed there, she said flatly. You're helping Alba, aren't you? Joska sighed. Savina, I know you don't agree with this, but I can't sit by and let the system burn. And Nicolau... You're letting Nicolau help? Savina's heart was pounding. I thought you were going to keep him safe. If anything happens to him... If you'd like to try to talk him out of this, you're welcome to, said Joska dryly. I hate to say this, Savina, but he's old enough to make his own decisions, and he's determined the Yibo won't kill his parents. His adoptive parents, I suppose. She paused, her voice growing serious. But I promise I'll do my best to keep him safe. Although I can't say I like our odds at the moment if Kachik decides to come after us. Savina closed her eyes and drew in a long breath. It hardly seemed to matter where she went or what she did. Nicolau would find a way to get himself into danger. Savina, said Joska at last. We're working blind right now. I know you're locked up, and I don't want you to put yourself in any more danger. But if you can find any way to delay the negotiations, it could mean the difference between whether we succeed or whether we die trying. Yeah, said Savina. I'll do what I can. Thank you, said Joska quietly, and we'll come for you as soon as we can, I promise, but please take care of yourself until then. There was a click and the connection died. Savina sat where she was for a long, long moment, staring at the wall. It could mean the difference between whether they succeeded or whether they died trying, Joska had said. She was locked up in a damn cell with her worst enemy, probably about to be killed, but idiot that she was, she'd find a way, somehow. She leaned against the wall again, shivering at the cool seeping into her skin. It was late in the day, judging from the light trickling in from outside, and she wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting. Hey, Reika, she said finally. Reika didn't answer. Savina turned to look at her. She was still lying on the cot, her body stiff, her shoulders set in anger. She must have overheard at least Savina's portion of the conversation, but she didn't give any sign whatsoever. Savina narrowed her eyes. The worry and the ache in her chest had twisted together into a tight, uncomfortable knot, exacerbating her restlessness. This wasn't going to end well. She knew it wouldn't, but she couldn't help herself. Like back in the Rim Mountains, poking at one of the slow, yellow-crested lizards with a blade of grass until it turned to bite you and you had to jerk your hand out of the way. Reka? She made her voice plaintive and innocent. Shut up, Reka snapped, not turning. Reka, she whined. Come on, talk to me. I'm bored. You say I'm not worth anything? What about you then, now that you're all locked up? What's your life worth? Finally, Reka rolled over and sat up, leaning back against the wall behind the cot. The sharp, harsh anger was gone from her expression, replaced once again with that infuriating, cool indifference. If I tell you, will you shut up? There was a weariness under her aloof tone that Savina didn't remember hearing there before. I suppose my life is worth however many guards and politicians I can take down with me before I die. Reka smiled, a small, humorless smile. I'm sure they'll bring me in front of Kachik again at some point. I probably won't kill him, but I may be able to kill some others before they kill me. She wasn't looking at Savina, just staring at the wall, and Savina watched her in silence for a few moments, an odd, uncomfortable emotion stirring inside her. Reka hadn't sounded afraid to die, which honestly wasn't that much of a surprise. Savina couldn't remember ever seeing Reka look afraid, but she'd expect at least some emotion, elation or sadness or something. What the hell is wrong with you? Savina asked at last, irritably. You won't kill who you need to if you do that, and you'll just die yourself. Reka glanced over, as if she'd forgotten Savina was there. Why does it matter? It doesn't, Savina snapped. But something about the dull resignation in the woman's eyes was unsettling, uncomfortable. She hadn't known Reka for long, and since knowing her, this was the longest she'd been in Reka's presence without one of them trying to kill the other. And, she realized, she knew nothing at all about Reka Soler. There was a tap on the door to their cell, then the click of a lock. The door swung open, and a Yibo woman in a fine tunic stepped through, flanked by 2 guards. One of them held a tray of food. The woman in front ignored Savina, smiling a close-lipped Yibo smile at Reka. Kachik asked me to come make sure that you were comfortable. Reka studied her. You're Kachik's defense chief, aren't you? She asked at last. The woman nodded, smiling wider, and Savina caught the glint in Reka's eyes, the grim, almost imperceptible smile, the way she shifted, as if readying herself to move. I suppose my life is worth however many guards and politicians I can take down with me before I die. Reka didn't care that she'd be killed, only that she could take someone with her. And this was Kachik's defense chief, probably important enough from Reka's point of view. Reka shifted again, her muscles gathering like a cat prepared to pounce. And almost without thinking, Savina jumped to her feet. Her heart was pounding a fast, unsteady rhythm as she stepped quickly forward, placing herself between Reka and the Yibo politician. Oh! She gushed, turning to the guards with a wide, genuine-looking smile. You brought dinner! Thank you! I was so hungry! She wasn't sure why she'd done it, to be honest. Reka was old enough to deal with the consequences of her own stupidity, and maybe Savina would have found a way to escape in the confusion. But something about the look on Reka's face when she talked about dying. The guard looked at her askance, and she could feel Reka's glare burning a hole in the back of her tunic. Damn it. She needed something more distracting. Savina took a step closer to the guard, her eyes wide and guileless. I'm sorry. I'm not used to being locked up like this. She gave a faint little laugh. I've been crying and crying. I'm sorry. It's just so embarrassing. She sniffled. I hate to ask, but is there still blood on my face? I haven't been able to look in a mirror since we got caught, and it's just so awkward. The guard frowned, but put the food down and leaned closer. You're fine, he said. There's just a smudge on your jaw. She widened her eyes again. Oh, here? She rubbed a hand helplessly on her cheek. He gave an indulgent smile and reached in. No, here. His fingers brushed along her jawline. Savina widened her eyes, glanced over her shoulder at Reka. Sweetheart, she whispered. Reka, are you going to let someone do this to your girlfriend? A quick sequence of emotions played over Reka's face. Disgust, irritation, and then, What Savina had been waiting for. A sudden flash of realization. Reka smiled a little, got to her feet and crossed over to the guard. "No," she said thoughtfully. "No, I don't think I will." She grabbed Savina with one hand, pulling her around behind her. With the other, she hit the guard, hard enough to send him staggering back into the wall. The Yibo politician jumped back with a curse, and the guards who'd been waiting outside shouted in alarm, pushing the door open. But Savina had regained her feet, and she caught one of them by the arm, redirecting his momentum and sending him slamming into the cement wall beside her. Reka had already taken out 2 other guards, and Savina snatched the pistol from the guard she'd disabled, turned, and slammed it into the skull of a 4th. The nearest guards had rushed the politician out of the cell to safety as the fighting started, and Savina breathed a quick sigh of relief. As she and Reka finished off the guards in the cell, another company came pounding down the stairs, a dozen at least, their weapons at the ready. "Back! Step back and drop your weapons, this instant!" their leader shouted. Savina and Reka glanced at one another. Slowly, they complied. "Don't move," the Yibo guard panted, glaring at them. The Yibo politician straightened, brushing herself off. "Reka Soler," she growled. "I thought you and Kachik had a bargain. You attacked these guards without provocation. We want to work with you, but if you refuse to work with us—" Reka took a deep breath, her eyes brushing over Savina quickly. Then, as if she'd made a decision, she closed her hand possessively around Savina's arm. "He was trying to flirt with my girlfriend," she said in a flat voice, turning back to the politician. Savina fought back the small shiver of, well, something. Certainly not pleasure, because she would have to be literally out of her mind to enjoy being touched by Reka Soler. The woman stared at them. "I'm certain that was not the intention," she said at last, her tone hovering between belligerent and tentatively appeasing. "I said I'd work with you," said Reka, her tone icy, her hand still possessively around Savina's upper arm. "But if you think this is not flirting—" She reached out, sliding her fingers gently along Savina's jaw. Her touch was warm, fingers strong and calloused, and Savina's stomach did a strange flip-flop. Savina was willing to come with me, risk her life because she didn't want me to get hurt, and I'm supposed to repay her by standing by to watch any time a Yibo guard gets the urge to feel her up? Savina is not an object, and she won't be treated like one. She slid her arm around Savina's waist, her body angled, so she stood between Savina and the angry guards. And again, Savina had to fight back the strange flutter in her stomach. The politician's expression turned wary. "I'm sorry," she said at last. "I'm sure it was a misunderstanding, but I'll make it very clear that this sort of thing is not to happen again." Reka's expression was cold. "I hope it doesn't." At last, the woman nodded again and turned. "I shall inform Kachik of what happened, and I will personally vet the guards that are permitted to come down here from now on." "See that you do," said Reka. Once the Yibo were out of sight, Reka dropped her arm from around Savina, like the touch burned her. Savina stepped back quickly, trying to slow her pounding heart. For a few moments, the women stared at each other. "What?" snapped Savina. Reka's forehead was creased in a frown. "Why?" she asked finally, something like genuine bewilderment in her tone. "Maybe I was fooled by your poor, helpless, pitiful me act, too," Savina muttered sourly, turning away. She still had no idea why she'd stepped in, saved Reka's damn life. Something about the look on Reka's face when she'd talked about what her life was worth, maybe, or the helpless desperation in her expression earlier. Maybe her answer was truer than she'd thought. There was a soft sound behind her, and she spun, hand going to her knife. And then she stopped in complete shock. Reka was hunched over, shoulders shaking. She leaned back against the wall and slid down to the cot, bending over, elbows on her knees, face in her hands, laughing helplessly. Savina stood, utterly stupefied. At last, Reka recovered herself and straightened slowly, wiping at her eyes. She took a deep breath and, finally, she looked up at Savina. "So," she said, "Savina Moya has a heart after all. That I didn't expect." Savina narrowed her eyes, heart still beating too quickly. "You're wrong, Reka. I'm a selfish, heartless person with no redeeming qualities, and I don't give a damn if the entire Joias system burns. As far as I'm concerned, every last person on Colorita could be killed by the Yibo, or hunted down by the raiders for food, and I wouldn't lose a moment's sleep over it. Reka's mouth twitched, just a bit, and Savina scowled. Damn, Reka. Then she paused. But, Reka, she said slowly, you do care. You want to stop Kavako. And I might not care about the damn Joias system, but my baby brother does, and I owe him. She was talking faster now, her mind catching up to her words. He and my friends are trying to stop Kachik from getting through the portal, but they need time. Kachik needs you, and he underestimates me. And as much as I hate you, that, just now, worked better than I thought it would. Maybe. Reka's eyebrows were raised, her gaze turned serious. Your friends are trying to stop Kachik, she said at last. I assume that's who you were talking to earlier? How are they going to do it? They're going to shut down the mechanism that makes the portal. Savina's heart was pounding. There was no way. This was absurd, ridiculous. It would mean working beside Reka. For a moment, her mind jumped back to Reka's hand tightened possessively on her arm, the warmth of Reka's body against hers as Reka pulled her out of reach of the guard. She shoved the thought away. Reka's head was cocked to one side, and she studied Savina thoughtfully. If we do this, and we somehow survive, this doesn't pay your debt, she said at last. I still have a warrant out for your arrest. Savina smiled, her most innocent smile, with a trace of viciousness behind it. Believe me, the only reason I saved you just now is so that I could have the pleasure of killing you myself when this is over. Reka's mouth twitched again, just a bit. Well then, it seems we understand each other. And as you say, what you did with that guard worked better than I expected. She paused, closing her eyes briefly as if bracing herself before she looked back up at Savina. So I suppose you may as well tell your friends we'll see what we can do to give them time.